https://www.youtube.com/watch ?V equals NIT dash H 5 BZXRQ single dad. Joined a longest kiss dare. What happened next changed his daughter's life. Người cha đơn thân tham gia thử thách nụ hôn dài nhất. Điều xảy ra sau đó đã thay đổi cuộc đời con gái anh. The house had been quiet for so long that Daniel had started to mistake the quiet for peace. He woke at 5:30 the way he always did, before the alarm, before Sophie stirred in her room down the hall, before the Michigan morning had fully committed to being a morning. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, a habit he'd never managed to break, that brief window between sleep and function where his brain hadn't yet remembered everything it was supposed to carry. Then it remembered, the way it always did, and he got up. The floorboards in the hallway creaked in the same spot they always creaked. He'd been meaning to fix that for 2 years. He stepped over it out of reflex, then stopped and thought about how absurd it was that he'd memorized that particular creak and never fixed it. And then stopped thinking about it, because that was the kind of thought that led nowhere useful at 5:30 in the morning. Sophie's door was cracked open. He pushed it gently and looked in. She was a chaos sleeper, her blanket twisted around her legs, one sock on and one off. Her dark hair fanned out across the pillow like she'd been dropped from some height. She was 7 years old and she slept the way she did everything else, with complete, unapologetic commitment. Daniel watched her breathe for a few seconds, the way he still did even though she was past the age where that felt necessary. It was a habit he couldn't break either. He went downstairs and started the coffee. Outside the kitchen window, Millhaven was still dark. It was one of those small Michigan towns that people drove through on the way to somewhere else. 2 traffic lights, a diner called Patsy's that had been there since 1971, a hardware store, a library that doubled as a community center on weekends, and about 1,200 people who mostly knew each other's business whether they wanted to or not. Daniel had grown up 40 minutes away, in a town exactly like this one. He'd moved here with Claire 8 years ago because the cost of land was reasonable and they'd wanted space for a workshop. That was back when plans made sense. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter, not drinking it yet, just holding the mug. The workshop was out back, a converted 2-car garage with proper ventilation and enough tools to outfit a small crew, though it was just him. He built furniture, custom pieces mostly, the kind people commissioned when they had a specific vision and the patience to wait 4 to 6 weeks for it. He'd built a reputation slowly, the way reputations built in small towns were built, through referrals and word of mouth and one piece at a time. It wasn't a glamorous living, but it was his, and it was steady enough to keep the lights on and Sophie in school and the truck running. He was fine. He told himself this most mornings. He was fine. By the time Sophie came downstairs at 7, trailing her blanket and wearing only one sock, Daniel had her lunch packed and her cereal poured. "Dad," she said, in the tone of someone making a formal announcement, "I dreamed about a horse. Was it a good horse or a bad horse?" She thought about this seriously, climbing onto her stool at the kitchen island. "It was a medium horse. It bit someone, but they deserved it. Sounds like a reasonable horse. I want a horse. I know. We have a yard. We have a yard that would fit approximately 1/4 of a horse, Sophie." She stirred her cereal. "That's still something." He poured himself a second coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her eat. She had Claire's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looked lighter in direct sunlight, amber almost. She also had Claire's way of going completely silent when she was thinking hard, a stillness that could catch you off guard coming from a 7-year-old. Most of the time, Sophie was in motion, was noise and questions, and dropped things and doors left open. But sometimes she'd go quiet like this, and Daniel would feel a pull in his chest that he couldn't name properly, something between love and grief, and a third thing that didn't have a word. "The new lady is home," Sophie said. "What?" "Next door. The lights were on when I looked out my window last night." She pointed her spoon at the window facing the neighboring house. "The lights were on late." The house next door had been empty for most of the fall and winter. The previous owners, the Garfields, had moved to Florida to be closer to their daughter, and the place had sat vacant through October, November, December. Somebody had bought it in January. Daniel knew this because the Millhaven rumor circuit was faster and more reliable than any news service. But he hadn't met them. He'd noticed a moving truck in mid-February, had seen lights on a few evenings, but he kept his hours and he wasn't in the habit of going over to introduce himself. People had a right to settle in without a neighbor appearing on their doorstep the first week. "It's probably nothing," he said. "It's a lady," Sophie said, with absolute certainty. "I saw her in the window. She has long hair. You could barely see across the yard in February. I have good eyes." He didn't argue with this because it was true. Sophie had remarkable vision and a deeply inconvenient tendency to notice things. He dropped her at school at 8:15, the usual argument about her jacket happening and being lost by Daniel the usual way, and then he drove back and went to the workshop. He had a dining table in progress, white oak, 8 feet long, a commissioned piece for a family in Ann Arbor who were renovating their whole house. The table was at the stage that required the most patience, the sanding and finishing work that didn't look dramatic but determined everything about how the piece would feel and last. Daniel put on his headphones, found a podcast he'd been halfway through, and got to work. He didn't think about the neighbor. He thought about the table and the grain of the wood, and whether the finish he'd chosen would hold up to the family's claim that they had 3 kids under 10 who ate everything like it was a competitive sport. He thought about whether he needed to pick up more sandpaper. He thought about the creak in the hallway floorboard. He didn't think about the neighbor. He met her at 11:30. He'd gone out to the truck to grab a clamp he'd left on the back seat, and he was rummaging in the cab when he heard someone behind him and turned around. She was standing on the sidewalk that ran between their 2 driveways, holding a cardboard box, and she had stopped because she'd apparently also been surprised to find someone there. She was about his height when she was wearing shoes, but she was wearing ankle boots with a slight heel, and she had dark hair that she'd pulled back loosely in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly and hadn't thought about it since. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater that looked like it had been washed 100 times and was better for it. She was objectively a very attractive woman, but that wasn't the first thing Daniel noticed. The first thing Daniel noticed was that she was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought and was taking a moment to catch up to the present. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't see you there." "Same," he said. He straightened up with the clamp. "I'm Daniel. I live here." He gestured at his house in a way that was probably unnecessary. "Victoria," she said. "I just moved in next door. I keep saying just moved in, but it's been, 6 weeks now." She looked down the street like she was checking something. "Time is strange here." "Strange how?" "Slower. I mean that as a compliment." Daniel nodded. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. "You need help with the box?" She looked at the box in her arms like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "No, I've got it. Thank you." Then she added, "I've been meaning to come over. I kept putting it off because I didn't want to seem like I was, inserting myself." "You're fine," he said. "I'm not much of a welcomer anyway." Something crossed her face, amusement maybe, at the fact that he'd basically said I wasn't going to come over either, but she didn't push it. "Well, nice to finally meet you, Daniel." "You too," he said. He grabbed the clamp and went back to the workshop. He thought about her for approximately 4 minutes afterward, then thought about the table. Bam. The thing about Millhaven was that it was small enough that you couldn't maintain distance from someone who lived 30 feet away and had a sociable daughter. Daniel understood this in theory. He had not anticipated how thoroughly Sophie would demolish his plan to be a good but uninvolved neighbor. It started the second week of March. Sophie had spotted Victoria in her front yard, doing something with the garden bed along the front of the house, pulling out the dead growth from fall, and had gone directly over without asking, because Sophie's approach to social interaction was to identify a human and then go stand near them and start talking. Daniel saw this from the workshop window and set down his tools with the specific kind of parental resignation that has no cure. By the time he crossed the yard, Sophie was crouched next to Victoria in the garden bed, and the two of them were in the middle of what appeared to be a serious discussion about earthworms. "That one is really big," Sophie was saying, pointing at something in the soil. "That's a good worm," Victoria said. "The fat ones mean healthy soil." "How do you know?" "My grandmother had a garden. She was very serious about it." Victoria sat back on her heels and noticed Daniel approaching. She raised a hand in greeting. She had dirt on her knee. "Sorry," Daniel said when he was close enough. She does this." "I don't mind at all." Victoria sounded like she meant it. She was explaining the horse situation. He looked at Sophie. "You explained the horse situation to a stranger." "She's not a stranger anymore," Sophie said, with complete logic. "I know her name." "You've known her name for 40 seconds. So she's a new friend." Sophie stood up and brushed dirt off her knees with the efficiency of someone who had extensive experience getting dirty. "Victoria says she has peonies. I don't know what those are, but she says they're pink." "They come up in May," Victoria said. "You can come see them when they bloom, if you want." Sophie looked at Daniel with an expression that was doing a lot of work. It was asking permission, yes, but it was also already certain of the answer, and it contained a small editorial about how unreasonable a refusal would be. Daniel recognized this expression. It was disconcertingly a lot like Claire's. "We'll see," he said. They had a habit before Daniel consciously decided they had a habit. It wasn't anything formal. Victoria would be in the yard when Sophie got home from school, and Sophie would go over. Or Sophie would drag Daniel out on a Saturday, and somehow they'd end up in Victoria's kitchen for coffee while Sophie explored the house. Victoria had told her she could, once, and Sophie had taken that as a standing invitation. Or Daniel would be loading materials into the truck at 7 in the morning, and Victoria would come out for her own car, and they'd exchange a few words in the cold air, both of them holding coffee cups. It was light, easy, the kind of neighborly relationship that didn't ask anything complicated of either person. Except, the thing about Victoria, Daniel was learning in pieces, was that she didn't fill silence the way some people did, nervously, compulsively, with talk that was really just the sound of someone trying to make themselves comfortable. She could just sit in a room and be in it, and she didn't seem to need Daniel to perform ease or engagement. This, oddly, was the thing that made him most comfortable. He could drink his coffee without producing small talk for it. But she also, and this was the thing that slowly got under his guard, paid attention. Not in an invasive way. In the way that meant she remembered things. That Sophie had mentioned wanting to learn to draw horses. That Daniel had an Ann Arbor commission with a deadline in April. That the creak in his hallway floorboard had been there for 2 years and he hadn't fixed it yet. She mentioned the floorboard one evening in late March, sitting at his kitchen table while Sophie did homework at the other end. "You want me to take a look at it?" she said. "I'm decent with a screwdriver." He looked at her. "You're decent with a screwdriver." "Don't sound so surprised. I grew up taking things apart." She shrugged. You mention it sometimes. The creak." He hadn't realized he mentioned it. "I'll get to it eventually." "Sure." She didn't push it, but he thought about it later after she'd gone home and Sophie was in bed. He thought about the fact that she had been listening carefully enough to notice something he said in passing, and that she hadn't made it into anything, hadn't used it as a lever to push closer or get something. She'd just offered and let it go. This was, he recognized, a disarming quality. He didn't entirely trust it yet. Daniel had not talked about Claire to anyone in Mill Haven. Not extensively, not in the real way. People knew the facts. His wife had died 4 years ago, a car accident on I-96. She'd been coming home from visiting her mother, and it had been black ice and a truck drifting. People knew the facts because in a town this size, the facts circulated. And knowing the facts meant most people didn't ask questions because they felt like they already had the information. Which suited Daniel fine. What people didn't know, what Daniel had not said out loud to anyone in a very long time, was the specific texture of what those 4 years had been like. The way he'd rebuilt his life, not because he felt like rebuilding it, but because Sophie needed him to function, and so he functioned, and functioning became its own kind of normal. The way he'd gotten competent at single parenthood, the way you got competent at anything you had no choice about, through repetition, through failure, through learning what worked. The way he'd gotten careful about not needing things, not needing ease, not needing company in the evening that was more than functional, not needing to be known by anyone in a way that required him to be available for being known. He was fine. He had told himself this so many times it had stopped feeling like a lie, and started just feeling like a fact. The night he actually talked to Victoria was a Thursday in early April. Sophie had gone to bed. Daniel had been in the workshop late, finishing the Ann Arbor table, which had come together better than he'd expected. There was always that moment in a piece where you stopped fighting the material and started working with it, and the table had hit that moment in the last week and come out right. He was cleaning up when he noticed the light on in Victoria's kitchen through the gap in the fence. He didn't plan to go over. He just did. She was washing dishes when he knocked on the back door, and she looked surprised, but not unwelcoming, which he supposed was the minimum he could have hoped for. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah, He stopped because he didn't have a reason that made sense. "The table's done. The Ann Arbor piece." "That's good." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll make tea." He sat at her kitchen table while she made tea, and he looked at her kitchen, which was different from his in ways that interested him. She'd hung things on the walls, mismatched things, a mirror and a small wooden shelf and what looked like a print of a botanical drawing. And he thought about how it looked like someone actually lived here, like someone had made choices about what to put on the walls, and he realized that his own kitchen had nothing on the walls except the clock. "How long have you been in Millhaven?" he asked when she sat down across from him. 8 months. "From where?" She held her mug in both hands. "New York. Before that, Chicago. Before that, about 6 other places." She paused. "I ran a company. Global operations. Lots of moving." He'd known, in the way you knew things in Millhaven, that she had money. The house had been renovated before she moved in. New windows, new roof, work that cost more than the house was probably worth. But he hadn't known specifics. What kind of company? Technology, infrastructure software, not interesting to explain. She looked down at her tea. "I left it in good hands, or I hope I did." "Why Millhaven?" She was quiet for a moment. "I was married for 6 years. It ended last year." She said it flatly, not fishing for sympathy. "The life I'd built was very much our life, even if most of it was on my terms professionally. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't that life." She looked out the window over the dark yard. "My assistant found this town. I don't know why she picked it. I just came and walked around and it felt, I don't know, like a place where someone could breathe without it meaning something." Daniel turned his mug on the table. "What do you mean, meaning something?" "In my life before, everything was a signal. What you wore, where you ate, who you talked to at what party. Everything fed into something." She shook her head slightly. "Here I can stand in the hardware store for 20 minutes trying to decide between 2 kinds of caulk, and no one is going to interpret it." He laughed. He was surprised by the laugh. It came out before he planned it. Victoria looked up at the sound of it, not startled, more like pleased, like she'd been hoping for that and hadn't expected to get it. "That's a specific example," he said. "I have actually stood in your hardware store for 20 minutes choosing caulk." She smiled. "It was the best 20 minutes I'd spent in a year." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your marriage." "Thank you." She didn't flinch from it. "I'm sorry about your wife." He hadn't expected her to say it. He should have, maybe, given how Millhaven worked, but it caught him sideways. He nodded. He put his eyes back on his mug. "You don't have to," she started. "No, it's okay," he breathed. "It was 4 years ago. I figured out how to be in it." He paused. "Most days." Victoria didn't say anything. She didn't try to complete his sentence or offer a platitude about time or healing. She just sat with what he'd said, which was the right thing to do, and which Daniel noticed. "Sophie was 3 when it happened," he said. "She doesn't really remember Claire. She knows about her from photos and from what I tell her, but she doesn't have—" He stopped. "She doesn't have memories the way I do. She has a story instead." He turned his mug again. "Sometimes I wonder whether the story is enough. And then I watch her being Sophie, being completely herself, and I think she's going to be fine. But I don't always know if I did the right things." "She's clearly a person," Victoria said. "You can tell with kids. Some of them are already people, already themselves, and you can tell she's had room to become that." She shook her head. "That doesn't happen by accident." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the calm, direct quality he'd noticed before, the quality that didn't ask anything of him, that was just present. "She's going to come ask if she can help you plant those peonies," he said, "just so you know." "Good," Victoria said. "I'll put her to work." He went home an hour later. He stood in his dark kitchen for a moment before turning on the light. The clock on the wall said 11:40. He felt, and he noted this carefully, like someone who had just set down something he'd been carrying for a long time. Not permanently, not solved, but set down for a moment and allowed to rest on the ground. He went upstairs and stepped over the creaking floorboard and went to bed. Well, April moved into itself. Sophie helped plant the peonies. This involved a significant amount of digging and the discovery of 3 more earthworms that Sophie named provisionally. Victoria had bought extra bulbs and let Sophie choose where they went, which meant 2 of the 3 were planted in locations that were either going to work out beautifully or catastrophically. Sophie had placed them by intuition, pointing at spots in the bed and saying there with the confidence of a landscape architect, and Victoria had planted them there without argument. Daniel had watched this from the fence, not interrupting. He'd been fixing a piece of trim on the garage exterior, which gave him a legitimate reason to be in the vicinity without being in the middle of it. He'd noticed, without meaning to, the way Victoria talked to Sophie, not performing, not doing the adult talking to a child thing where you tilted your voice up and simplified everything. She just talked to her, explained real things, asked real questions and waited for real answers. Sophie, for her part, had decided entirely without announcement that Victoria was one of the important people. Daniel could tell by the way she talked about her, not separately, not as the neighbor, but woven into the general fabric of conversation, the way you talked about people who just existed in your life as a given. "Victoria says if you condition the wood right, it lasts longer than if you rush the finish," Sophie informed him one evening at dinner. Daniel set down his fork. "When did you talk to Victoria about wood finishing?" "She was watching me watch you in the workshop," Sophie said, as if this were completely normal, which apparently it had become. "She said you take a long time with the finish." "I do." "She said that's why your furniture is good." He looked at his daughter across the table. "You two have a lot of opinions about my work." Sophie shrugged. "I told her about the Ann Arbor table. She said it sounded like you cared about it, and that people can feel when something is made by someone who cared about it." She went back to her pasta. "I thought that was true." Daniel said nothing. He picked up his fork. After a moment, Sophie said, in a tone that was aiming for casual and missing slightly, "Do you think Victoria gets lonely?" "Why do you ask?" "She lives by herself." Sophie looked at her plate. "Sometimes she looks out the window for a long time, like she's thinking about something far away." He had noticed this too, the looking. He hadn't named it the way Sophie had. "People who live alone aren't necessarily lonely," he said, "but they can be." "They can be," he agreed. Sophie stirred her pasta. "Good thing we're here," she said, and moved on to the next subject with complete ease, leaving Daniel sitting with those 4 words like they weighed something. The spring fair announcement went up on the community board outside the library on a Thursday in late April. Annual Millhaven Spring Fair, first Saturday of May. Booths, live music, kids' activities, food from Patsy's and the church auxiliary. Community events including the 3-legged race, the pie contest, and, returning by popular demand, the longest kiss contest. Daniel walked past the announcement on his way to the hardware store and did not pay it particular attention. Sophie found it on Friday afternoon. She read the announcement 3 times, which Daniel knew because he had been there. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression that was so precisely calculated to appear innocent that it made him immediately uneasy. "The longest kiss contest," she said. "Sophie, it says returning by popular demand." "Sophie, you should enter," she said. "I'm not entering a kissing contest." "With Victoria," Sophie said, as if she were completing a sentence he'd started and left unfinished, as if the pairing were already obvious and had been for some time. He looked at his daughter, who looked back at him with the amber eyes and the preternatural stillness she sometimes had, and he thought, not for the first time, that she understood certain things at a level that should have been beyond 7 years old, and probably wasn't beyond 7 years old at all. Probably he'd just spent 4 years underestimating what she saw. Absolutely not, he said. Sophie smiled, which was somehow worse. She didn't push it. She just smiled and went to look at the rest of the announcement, and Daniel stood there feeling like he'd just lost an argument he hadn't known he was in. He told Victoria about it that evening because he went over, for no stated reason, just went over, which had become the kind of thing he did now. And Sophie had already been there for an hour and had already told her. He could tell by the look on Victoria's face when he walked in. She was standing at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, and she had the particular expression of someone who was working hard to keep their face neutral. Sophie mentioned the fair, he said. Sophie mentioned the kissing contest, Victoria said. Yeah. She was very thorough about it. I bet she was. There was a pause. Victoria set down the knife and turned to face him, and they looked at each other across the kitchen, and Daniel became aware of something that had been there for a while and that he'd been working hard not to be aware of. It was the kind of awareness that was like a splinter. Not painful exactly, more like a constant small presence that made itself known whenever you moved a certain way. I told her it wasn't appropriate, Victoria said. Good. She said you'd say that. Victoria's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile, more like something being held back. She said you needed to be pushed. She's 7, Daniel said. She does not have valid opinions about what I need. She has surprisingly valid opinions about most things, Victoria said. He couldn't argue with this. He stood in her kitchen looking at her, looking at the set of her jaw, the way she'd pushed a strand of hair back, the small, careful way she was watching him, and he thought, she feels it too. He was almost certain of it. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd gotten very good at not knowing what to do with certain things and just leaving them alone. We're not entering the kissing contest, he said. Agreed, Victoria said. Good. Obviously. He stayed for dinner. He didn't entirely mean to, but Sophie set his place at the table with the easy assumption that he was staying, and he looked at the 3 settings and thought about saying something and then just sat down. They ate. Sophie talked about the earthworms and her teacher and a theory she had about why certain crayons broke faster than others. Victoria and Daniel talked about the fair and the town and a tree in Daniel's backyard that was probably going to need to come down this summer. Normal things. Real things. When Sophie finally fell asleep on the couch, she'd transferred there after dinner, claiming she was just resting and been unconscious within 4 minutes. Daniel carried her across the yard to his house and put her in bed with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and she barely stirred. He stood in her doorway for a moment. The light from the hallway caught her hair on the pillow. Good thing we're here, she'd said. He stepped over the creak in the floorboard. He lay in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, thinking about nothing he could name, and eventually slept. The May morning smelled like cut grass and the particular thing that happened to Michigan air right at the edge of spring turning into something warmer. Daniel was loading his truck. He'd volunteered, at Sophie's insistence, to help set up the fair booths, which he'd agreed to because the volunteer list had been short and he had a truck, when Victoria came out of her house. She was wearing a blue linen shirt and had her hair down, which she didn't always have it, and she was carrying a covered dish that smelled like something with cinnamon. Pie contest? He asked. God, no. I can't compete with the women who've been entering that for 30 years. She set the dish on the porch railing and came down the steps. I'm just bringing something for the food table. Cinnamon coffee cake. She looked at the truck. Is there room? Yeah. He moved a bag of tent stakes. Hop in. Sophie emerged from the house at that exact moment, correctly dressed and wearing both shoes, which was unusual enough that Daniel looked at her twice. She was also wearing an expression that had a suspicious amount of strategy in it for 7 in the morning. You're both going together, she said. That's nice. Get in the truck, Daniel said. Sophie got in the truck. She sat between them on the bench seat and kept her face very carefully forward and did not say another word about it, which was the most suspicious behavior she was capable of. The fair was everything a Millhaven fair was, which is to say it was small and earnest and slightly chaotic and genuinely good. The food was good. The kids' games were run by the kind of volunteers who took them seriously, and the live music was a local band that had been playing variations of the same set list at community events for 15 years and played it with real pleasure. Daniel set up booths. Victoria helped because she'd brought the coffee cake and been absorbed immediately into the volunteer corps by Mrs. Patsy from the diner, who had a gift for conscripting people. Sophie ran with a group of kids Daniel recognized from her school and appeared every 45 minutes or so to confirm that she was alive and ask for money for something. It was a normal town Saturday. Daniel allowed himself to be in it. The kissing contest was at 2 o'clock. He'd forgotten about it almost. He was at the woodworking demonstration booth. Someone had asked him to come and he'd said yes, which he sometimes did, showing kids how a hand plane worked, letting them feel the way the wood responded. When he heard the announcement from the main stage and then heard Sophie's voice directly behind him. "Dad," she said, "it's 2 o'clock." He turned around. She was standing there with Victoria behind her, and Sophie had her hands clasped together, and she was looking at him with an expression that was pure 7-year-old hope, transparent and devastating and impossible to be angry at. "Sophie," his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Just once," she said. "Just enter once. You don't have to win. Just try." He looked past her at Victoria, who had her arms crossed slightly, and was looking at Sophie with a combination of exasperation and something softer underneath. And then she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fair moved around them. Music from the stage, kids yelling, the smell of the coffee cake from the food table, cinnamon and warm air. Victoria uncrossed her arms. "I might regret this," she said quietly, to him, not to Sophie. "Yeah," he said, "but I'm willing to try things I might regret. Occasionally." She looked at him steadily. "Only if you are." Sophie made a sound that was very close to the sound of someone who had been planning something for a long time, watching it finally fall into place. Daniel looked at Victoria. He thought about the kitchen at 11:40. He thought about the 3 settings at the table. He thought about the floorboard he'd never fixed, and whether some things you kept not fixing because somewhere in the unfixed version was a reason to still be where you were. "Okay," he said. Sophie grabbed both their hands and started pulling them toward the main stage, and Daniel let himself be pulled, which was not something he did easily or often, and which felt in that moment like the beginning of something he didn't have the language for yet. The announcer was already calling for contestants. He didn't look at Victoria again until they were standing at the edge of the stage. When he did, she was looking at him. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who was afraid of something. And for some reason, for the particular reason that fear in her face looked exactly like what was happening in his chest, that made him more willing, not less. He offered his hand. She took it. They walked up. The stage at the Millhaven Spring Fair was not built for drama. It was a low wooden platform, maybe 2 feet off the ground, the kind of thing that got assembled every May by the same 4 volunteers using the same bolt pattern they'd memorized years ago. There was a banner across the back that said Millhaven Spring Fair in red and yellow letters, one corner slightly lower than the other. The microphone stand had a piece of electrical tape wrapped around it where it had cracked sometime around 2019 and never been properly replaced. None of this stopped it from feeling, to Daniel, like the most exposed place he had stood in years. There were 3 other couples on the stage. The Hendersons, who had been married for 32 years and entered this contest annually the way some people did crossword puzzles, for sport, with no anxiety about the outcome. A pair of teenagers who were clearly daring each other and kept breaking into nervous laughter. And a couple Daniel didn't recognize, probably from out of town, who seemed to have wandered into the fair and the contest in the same loose, spontaneous way. The announcer, Ray Colburn, who ran the bait shop on Route 9 and did double duty as fair MC every year, explained the rules into the crackling microphone with the practiced comfort of a man who loved this particular duty. The rules were straightforward. Both people had to maintain lip contact. Hands were permitted. The last couple with unbroken contact won. There was a $100 gift card to the hardware store. The crowd around the stage had grown, maybe 60 or 70 people, and Daniel could see Sophie in the front row with her hands still clasped and an expression of intense concentration, like she was willing the outcome into existence through focus alone. Victoria was standing to his left. He could feel her there without looking. She was very still, the same stillness he'd noticed in that first week, but it was a different quality now, Not comfortable stillness, more like someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the moment when making the decision stopped being reversible. "You nervous?" he asked, quietly enough that only she could hear. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yeah." They didn't say anything else. Ray Colburn counted down from 3. The Henderson couple kissed with the easy familiarity of people who had been kissing each other for 3 decades. Comfortable, practiced, no performance in it. The teenagers lasted 40 seconds before one of them started laughing and couldn't stop. The out-of-town couple had clearly done this before. They settled into it like it was a task they were competent at. Daniel turned to Victoria. She was already looking at him. Up close, he could see the faint tension at the corners of her eyes, and the way she was breathing slightly faster than normal, and he thought, she's as scared as I am, and for some reason this made it possible. He put his hand at her jaw, and she put her hand flat against his chest, not gripping, just resting there. And they kissed. It was careful at first. That was the only word for it. Careful and tentative, the way you'd test ice before trusting your weight to it. Just contact, just the basic fact of it, not asking anything more than what was necessary to technically satisfy the conditions of the contest. The out-of-town couple dropped out at the 3-minute mark. Some kind of involuntary laughter, not unlike the teenagers. Ray Colburn noted it with gentle ceremony. Daniel and Victoria and the Hendersons remained. And this was the part that Daniel had not planned for. At some point, he couldn't identify exactly when, the kiss stopped being careful. He didn't decide this. It wasn't a choice he made in any conscious sense. It was more like a dam that gives way not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, quiet yielding. The accumulated weight of something becoming more than the barrier can hold. Her hand on his chest had shifted slightly, had pressed in rather than rested. His hand at her jaw had moved back into her hair. The careful distance between their bodies had closed. He became aware dimly of the crowd, not in a social anxiety way. He'd mostly stopped being aware of the crowd several minutes ago. He became aware of it because it had gone oddly quiet. The fair noise continued around them, the music and the kids and the ambient sound of 60 people eating and talking, but the specific noise of the crowd immediately around the stage had stilled, the way a crowd stills when it senses something real is happening and doesn't want to interrupt it. He didn't open his eyes. He was aware of Victoria's breathing, the rhythm of it, and of the fact that somewhere in the last few minutes, the context, the stage, the banner, Ray Colburn and his taped microphone stand, had dropped away entirely, and there was just this. Just her hands and his hands and the fact of years of loss and loneliness compressed into the specific warmth of another person who had also lost things and also been alone. The Hendersons dropped at 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Margaret Henderson laughed as they broke apart, and her husband said something that made her laugh harder, and the crowd around them applauded with the warmth reserved for people they genuinely liked. Ray Colburn's voice came through the microphone. And we still have one couple standing, or I guess technically, we have one couple who can't seem to stop. He laughed. The crowd laughed with him, warm, not unkind. Daniel and Victoria didn't stop. He didn't know how long it went after the Hendersons dropped. It went until it stopped, until the moment when something shifted and they both became aware again of where they were and broke apart by a kind of mutual gravity, not pulled away from each other but settling back into the world, the way you surface from deep water. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him. Her hand was still at his chest. His was still in her hair. The crowd was applauding. Ray Colburn was saying something into the microphone. Sophie was in the front row with both hands over her mouth and her eyes very wide and very bright. 6 minutes and 14 seconds, Ray announced with genuine admiration. I think we have a new record, folks. Victoria took a slow breath. She lowered her hand from his chest. He lowered his from her hair. Well, she said. Her voice was careful in a new way, different from before. Yeah, he said. He didn't know what else to say. He was not sure his brain had fully reconnected to the part that produced language. Ray handed them the hardware store gift card, which Daniel took on autopilot. Someone in the crowd, he thought it was Margaret Henderson, said something approving that he didn't fully process. Sophie appeared at the edge of the stage with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and achieving approximately none of it. You did very well, she said, in a tone of a judge delivering a verdict. Sophie, Daniel said, I'm just saying. Get your jacket, He stopped. He didn't know what they were. He looked at Victoria, who looked back at him with the particular expression of someone standing at the edge of something and not entirely sure of the ground ahead. I should, she said, and gestured vaguely back toward the fair. Yeah, he said. She went. He watched her go, and then he looked down at Sophie, who was watching him with those eyes that saw too much. Stop, he said. I didn't say anything, Sophie said. You were about to. She pressed her lips together. Then, did it feel like something? He put his hand on top of her head. Let's go find something to eat. She let him redirect her, which she did sometimes when she sensed she'd gotten as much as she was going to get. But she took his hand as they walked and held it tighter than usual, and he noticed this and didn't say anything about it. The drive home was quiet. Sophie had exhausted herself by 3:30 and fallen asleep against the truck window with the reliability of a child who had hit her limit, and Daniel drove through the late afternoon light thinking about nothing he was willing to think about directly. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. Victoria's car was already there. She'd left the fair before them, earlier than he'd expected, actually, and the lights in her kitchen were on. He could see them through the side yard. He sat. He was not a man who ran from things. He didn't think of himself that way. He'd done hard things, had stayed in his house the night after Claire died when every instinct told him to go somewhere else, anywhere else, just not there. He'd stayed because Sophie needed him to stay, and because running from your grief didn't work the way people hoped it did. He knew that. But there was a category of hard thing that wasn't grief and wasn't loss. There was the hard thing that was possibility. And possibility was, in its own way, more frightening than grief, because grief had a shape already. It had already happened. You were already in it. Possibility had no shape yet. Possibility could still go wrong. He got out of the truck and carried Sophie inside and put her on the couch with a blanket, and then stood in his kitchen for a long minute. Then he went next door. He knocked. Victoria opened the door, and she had clearly been somewhere else in her head. Her eyes refocused when she saw him, the way eyes did when you were pulled out of your thoughts. Can I come in? He said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She didn't move to the kitchen or offer anything. They both just stood in her entryway, which was a small space with a coat rack and a mirror and a rug that had a geometric pattern he'd never paid attention to before, and now was paying too much attention to as a way of not looking directly at her. I don't know what that was, he said. She waited. He stopped. I know what it was technically, I just don't know what it means for... He made a gesture that was trying to indicate the space between them and their houses and Sophie across the yard. You don't have to figure it out right now, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to. I know that too. He finally looked at her properly. But I want to say something so that I'm not just... So that you know I didn't stand up there and... He rubbed the back of his neck. I wasn't performing something, back there. Her face changed, not dramatically, just a slight softening, the dropping of something she'd been holding. I know, she said quietly. He breathed out. I've been careful for a long time. I've been careful about not... He was not doing well at this. He was normally more competent with language than this. About not starting things I wasn't ready to be in. Daniel, she said. I'm not saying I'm ready now either, he said quickly. I'm not saying... Daniel. She said it again, steadier. I understand what you're saying. You don't have to build the whole case for it. He stopped. She leaned against the wall beside the coat rack and looked at him with the calm directness that had been one of the first things he'd noticed about her 8 months ago in the space between their driveways. I've been here, she said. I've been here, and I've watched you with Sophie, and I've watched you work, and I've had coffee in your kitchen, and I've tried to be... She paused. I've been careful too, for different reasons maybe, but careful. I know that. What happened today was... She looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at him. It was real. For me. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't, because I don't do that well, pretending. You could have fooled me, he said. You're pretty even-keeled. That's not the same as not feeling things. She crossed her arms loosely. Even keeled is how I function. It's not the same as nothing happening underneath. He thought about the looking out windows. Sophie had named it before he had. I'm not asking you for anything, Victoria said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here with expectations about what today means or what happens next. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you the truth. So you have accurate information. He almost laughed. Accurate information. I'm a data person at heart. Right. He did laugh. A short, quiet one. Then it faded and he was just standing there in her entryway, and she was just standing there against her wall, and the kitchen light was behind her and the evening outside was going gold through the window, and he felt it again. The thing he'd been feeling for weeks that he'd been calling something else, calling familiarity, calling proximity, calling the reasonable warmth of someone who is kind and present and good with his daughter, calling it everything except what it was. I have to be careful, he said, about Sophie. I know. She already has ideas about how this goes. I saw her face up there. Victoria nodded. She's not subtle. She's 7. She shouldn't have to be. He paused. But if something... He stopped. If we did, if this was something, and then it wasn't, she doesn't have a lot of practice losing people. Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke carefully. I understand that. I think about that too. You do? Of course I do. She looked at him. Do you think I haven't been thinking about exactly that for the last 4 months? He realized, with some discomfort, that he hadn't fully considered whether she was navigating all of this too. He'd been so occupied with his own careful management of it that he'd been somewhat selfish about the internal complexity on her side. I'm sorry, he said. You've been managing something complicated, she said. So have I. That's just what this is. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer, then said, Sophie's asleep on my couch. I should be there when she wakes up. Go. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned back. The thing you said, he said, accurate information. Yes. I have some too. He said it without planning it, and then it was out there, and he watched her face process it. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I have it. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face that she let move, didn't hold back. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. He went home. He sat in his kitchen and listened to Sophie breathe on the couch and thought about the last 6 hours in a way that wasn't quite processing and wasn't quite avoidance. It was something in between, the mental equivalent of holding something in your hands and not opening it yet, but feeling the weight of it. Sunday was strange. Not bad strange. Just strange in the way that days are strange when something is shifted underneath them without the surface having fully caught up. The light was the same, and the coffee tasted the same, and Sophie woke up demanding waffles with a clarity of purpose that was consistent with every other Sunday. But Daniel moved through the morning with the specific self-consciousness of someone who knew he was being observed, not by any external person, just by himself, by some internal watcher who had decided overnight to pay closer attention. He made the waffles. He fixed the broken clasp on Sophie's lunchbox that had been broken since March. He went to the workshop and spent 2 hours on a new commission, a rocking chair, a 75th birthday gift from a woman's adult children, and couldn't entirely concentrate, which annoyed him. He was not a man who let things disrupt his concentration easily. At noon, Sophie appeared in the workshop doorway. Victoria's making soup, she said. He set down his tools. How do you know that? I could smell it from the yard. That seems unlikely. I have good senses. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides. She said if we wanted, we could come for lunch. He had not seen Victoria since the night before. He had thought about her 4 times that morning and noted each instance with mild exasperation. Did she actually say that, or are you volunteering us? Sophie had the decency to look slightly caught. She said it was possible. Sophie. She did say it. She said, tell your dad there's soup if he wants. Sophie paused. Those were approximately her words. He thought about it for a moment, which was probably already the answer, because if the answer were no, he wouldn't have needed a moment. Go tell her we'll be over in 20 minutes, he said. And don't tell her we're coming like you already knew we were coming. Sophie's face did the thing where she almost smiled and held it back. I'll be very surprised, she promised. Gulti. The soup was vegetable barley, thick and properly seasoned, the kind of thing that took longer than it looked like it took. Victoria had bread from the bakery 2 streets over. The good bread, the sourdough that the Kowalski family had been making for 40 years. And she'd sliced it and put butter on the table, and there was none of the performance of a meal that was supposed to mean something, which probably meant it meant something. Sophie talked about the fair. She talked about the 3-legged race she'd entered with her friend Marisol, and how they'd come in second, and the ribbon was yellow, and yellow was actually her second favorite color now. Because of this, previously her second favorite had been orange. She talked about the earthworms in the garden, and whether they had names yet, and Victoria said she'd been thinking Gerald for the large one, which Sophie found completely correct. Daniel ate soup and listened and let the meal be what it was. At one point, when Sophie had taken her bowl to the counter and was apparently conducting some kind of investigation into what was in Victoria's pantry, an exploration Victoria had permitted without comment, there was a silence between them, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't nothing either. You sleep okay? Victoria asked. Mostly, he said. You? Not particularly. She said it plainly, not complaining, just answering. No. She moved her spoon through the remnants of her soup. I've been thinking about what you said, the accurate information. I probably shouldn't have said it like that. Why? It sounds clinical. I liked it, she said. It was honest without asking me to do anything with it. She looked up at him briefly. That's actually rare. He thought about that. In what context? In the context of... She paused, and he could see her deciding how much to say. In the relationships I've had, everything always had pressure attached. Everything was a bid for a specific response. She shrugged. You just said a thing because it was true, and then went home. That's a low bar, he said. You'd be surprised, she said, and something in the way she said it told him it came from somewhere specific, from the 6 years of the marriage she'd mentioned only in outline. He didn't ask. If she wanted to fill in the outline, she would, in time or not. Sophie reappeared from the pantry holding a jar of something. What's tahini? Ground sesame, Victoria said. It goes in hummus. Sophie looked at the jar with deep suspicion. Why? Taste it and find out. What if I don't like it? Then you've learned something about yourself. Sophie considered this framework, found it reasonable, and opened the jar. The week after the fair should have been awkward, and mostly wasn't. Daniel was not sure what to do with this. Had half expected a recalibration, some version of 2 adults looking at each other and feeling the weight of what they'd let happen and retreating to a safer distance. He'd been prepared for that. He told himself he was prepared for it. Instead, it was just Tuesday, then Wednesday. Victoria came over Wednesday evening because Sophie had mentioned a project for school that involved making a model of the solar system and had apparently mentioned to Victoria that she needed help, and Victoria arrived with a bag of craft supplies that she clearly had not just wandered out to buy on a whim. You planned this, Daniel said when she came through the door. Sophie mentioned it Sunday, Victoria said, setting the bag on the kitchen table. She's been running a full operation, Daniel said. Obviously. Victoria pulled out foam balls of various sizes and a can of spray paint. Are you going to complain, or are you going to help Jupiter look like Jupiter? He helped Jupiter look like Jupiter. It was an hour and a half of soup and craft supplies, and Sophie explaining at length why Saturn was the best planet due to the rings, and Victoria agreeing that the rings were objectively superior, and Daniel arguing for practicality's sake that Jupiter had more moons and moons were more interesting, and Sophie looking at him like he was saying something embarrassing, and Victoria laughing, a real laugh, one of the ones that broke through whatever composed surface she kept most of the time. He noticed the laugh. He noticed that it was something she didn't give out easily. He filed this information alongside the other things he'd been filing. When Sophie went to bed and Victoria started packing up the remaining craft supplies, Daniel said, "She's going to fail this project." Victoria looked at him. What? Saturn is clearly not the right color. That's clearly Martian red. Victoria looked at the Saturn they'd made. We used red because she insisted red was more interesting than beige. Her teacher is going to know. Her teacher is going to see a child who spent real time on something and cared about it. Victoria sealed the paint can. That's worth more than the correct color of Saturn. He stood at the kitchen counter and watched her pack up the bag. You really believe that? I do. She picked up the bag. I had a lot of gold stars growing up. Perfect grades, perfect projects, right color of Saturn. She looked at him. It didn't make me more equipped for anything that actually mattered. He thought about that. He thought about the 6 years of marriage she'd mentioned, about running a company across multiple cities, about standing in a hardware store for 20 minutes choosing caulk and calling it the best 20 minutes in a year. I'll walk you out, he said. They stood on his porch for a moment, the May night around them, which was finally warm enough to be comfortable without a jacket. The yard was dark except for the porch light and the light from her kitchen across the way, which she'd left on. The peonies are almost open, she said, looking toward her garden. Sophie checks them every afternoon. I know. I watch from the window sometimes. She said it without self-consciousness, not making it more than it was. She talks to them. She talks to everything, he said. Victoria smiled, not the full laugh, but something quieter and more private. Then she stepped off the porch. Good night, Daniel. Good night. He watched her cross the yard, the small figure of her moving through the dark toward her lit kitchen, and he stood on the porch after she'd gone inside, and the light in her kitchen moved from the window nearest him to the window on the far side, which was probably the living room. He stood there probably longer than he needed to. Then he went inside and stepped over the creak in the floorboard, which he still hadn't fixed, and which he was becoming gradually aware he was keeping for reasons he wasn't ready to look at directly. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He thought about Sophie, asleep down the hall. He thought about the model of the solar system drying on the kitchen table, wrong-colored Saturn and all. He thought about what Victoria had said. I've been careful too. For different reasons, maybe. He thought about the 6 minutes and 14 seconds. He thought about the specific feeling of her hand pressing flat against his chest. Not gripping, just pressing, just making contact, the way you touch something to confirm it was real. He laid back on the bed. Outside his window, in the yard, the peonies were opening in the dark. He couldn't see them from here. He knew they were there anyway. The peonies opened fully on a Thursday. Sophie discovered this at 3:50 in the afternoon, approximately 4 minutes after getting off the school bus, and she came through the back door already talking about it before Daniel had turned around from the kitchen counter. They're open, she said. All 3 of them, the ones I planted, are open. All 3? All 3. She dropped her backpack on the floor, which he would ordinarily ask her to pick up, but she was already back out the door before he could say anything, screen door swinging behind her. He picked up the backpack and hung it on the hook and went to the window. She was in Victoria's garden on her knees in front of the peony bed, and Victoria had come out the back door and was crouching beside her, and the 2 of them were looking at the flowers with the seriousness of people examining something genuinely important. The peonies were pink, a deep, saturated pink that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made sense of why someone would bother with them. Sophie said something. Victoria said something back. Then Sophie put her face close to the nearest bloom and stayed there for a moment, just breathing it in, and Victoria watched her do this with an expression that Daniel could see even from the window and couldn't look away from. It was not a complicated expression. It was just care, uncomplicated and unguarded, the kind that didn't know it was being watched. He went back to making dinner. But the week after the fair had been careful and real, and this week was becoming something else, something that had less careful in it and more just normal. The normal of people who had admitted something true and were now figuring out how to live around it without dismantling everything that worked. It wasn't smooth. He would be the first to say this. There was a Tuesday where he'd been short with Victoria over something minor. She'd mentioned in passing that a contractor she'd used before could look at the backyard tree he'd been concerned about, and he'd reacted with more edge than the moment warranted, something about handling his own property, and she'd gone quiet in a way that wasn't hurt exactly, but was a very specific kind of stepping back. He'd apologized that evening. She'd accepted it without ceremony, which was its own kind of grace, but the moment had told him something about himself that he didn't entirely like, that some part of him still flinched at proximity, still read help as something that could be taken away. There was also the problem of Millhaven itself. He'd known this was coming. 60 or 70 people had watched them on that stage, and while Millhaven was not a malicious town, it was a thorough one. By Monday after the fair, Margaret Henderson had mentioned it to Patsy from the diner, who had mentioned it to the Kowalskis, and the Kowalskis' daughter was in Sophie's class, and so by Tuesday, Sophie had come home with a report that 3 different people had asked her about Dad and the lady next door. "What did you tell them?" Daniel asked. "I said you were friends," Sophie said. She was eating an apple with great efficiency. Then Gracie Kowalski said her mom said it looked like more than friends. She looked at him without particular emotion, just gathering information. "Is it more than friends?" He sat down at the kitchen table. "Sophie, I'm not trying to make it complicated," she said. "I just want to know what to say when people ask." He looked at his daughter, who was 7 and eating an apple and asking a completely reasonable question with the pragmatic directness she'd inherited from someone. Probably him, probably to his own inconvenience. "Tell them it's grown-up stuff and you don't know all the details." Sophie considered this. "That's true," she said, which implied she found it acceptable because it was honest. "Yes," he said. "It is." She ate her apple. Then, "But you like her." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Sophie nodded once, satisfied, and moved on to the subject of the solar system project, which her teacher had apparently given a B+, which Sophie regarded as evidence that the wrong color of Saturn had not, in fact, been held against her. He told Victoria about the B+ that evening, and she looked unreasonably pleased about it. They were on his back porch, which had become the default location for the end of the evening when the weather allowed it. Sophie was inside doing the bedtime routine with a negotiated level of independence. She was allowed to pick her own pajamas and brush her teeth without supervision, as long as she could prove she'd actually brushed them, the proof being a brief smile and inspection at the end, which she submitted to with minimal protest. This gave Daniel approximately 20 minutes, sometimes 30 if she decided to read. B+ on a wrong-colored Saturn, Victoria said. "I'm choosing to read that as the universe rewarding creative conviction. I'm choosing to read it as a teacher who didn't feel like arguing about the rings. Those are not mutually exclusive." She had her coffee. She drank it later than Daniel thought was reasonable, but she'd told him once that her body had essentially given up on a normal sleep schedule years ago, and she'd made peace with it. And she was looking out at the yard, at the last of the light going out of it. "She told me about the Kowalski conversation," she said. He nodded. He'd expected she would. "Did she ask you the same question?" "She asked if I liked you." Victoria looked at her coffee cup. She was very direct about it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." She said it the same way she'd said, "I'm telling you the truth so you have accurate information," plainly, without making more of it than it was. I figured she already knew, and lying to her seemed worse than the conversation. He thought about this. "She would have known," he agreed. "She always knows." "She's something," Victoria said, and the way she said it, not as a performance of liking his child, but with the specific warmth of someone who had genuinely been impressed, settled something in him that had been unsettled. A car went down the street in front of the house, headlights cutting briefly across the side yard. The evening was settling into its own rhythm. Sophie appeared at the back door to demonstrate her teeth, which were demonstrably brushed, and Daniel did the inspection and said goodnight, and she looked at Victoria and said goodnight to her too, with the easy affection of someone for whom this had become a given, and went back inside. Daniel and Victoria sat with the quiet for a moment. "She told me something once," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came up the way things came up sometimes, from somewhere underneath. "About wondering if you got lonely. Watching you look out the window." Victoria was still for a moment. "When did she say that?" "Weeks ago, before the fair." He turned his mug. "She has this way of naming things before I do." "What did you say to her?" "I said people who lived alone weren't necessarily lonely." He paused. "She said they could be. And then she said, 'Good thing we're here.'" He heard Victoria breathe out. It wasn't a sigh exactly, more like something releasing. She's 7, Victoria said. How is she this? She didn't finish the sentence. I don't know, he said. She just is. They sat with that. The night was warm, genuinely warm now, the kind that meant Michigan had finally committed to spring, and the garden was dark, but you could smell it, the peonies and the cut grass and the wet earth from the sprinkler system Victoria had finally figured out how to program. Were you? He asked. Lonely. She thought about it properly, didn't give him an easy answer. Yes, she said, not in a dramatic way. Just in the way where you realize that being busy is not the same as being connected, and you've been busy for so long that you stop noticing the difference. She looked at the dark yard. I was in my marriage and I was lonely. That was... She stopped. That was the harder thing to admit. That you can be technically not alone and still be isolated from the person who's supposed to know you. He understood this differently than he thought he would have before Claire. Was it always like that? No. She shook her head. It started fine. Marcus was compelling, smart, attentive, the kind of person who made you feel like the most important thing in the room. She turned her cup. That quality works differently when you're building something together than when you've built it, and he's looking for the next room to be important in. She paused. I kept thinking if I got the company to the next milestone, if we moved to the right city, if I gave him the right thing to be proud of. I kept thinking it was a problem I could solve. And it wasn't. It was just incompatibility dressed up as a project. She looked at him. By the time I admitted it, I'd been solving the wrong problem for 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, for the second time, but this time he was sorry for the specific thing she'd described, not just for the fact of the marriage ending. It's okay, she said. It got me here. She said it without drama, just as a fact. I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to think, that the path was worth what it cost, but it's what I think. He thought about I-96 and black ice and a truck drifting. He thought about Claire. He thought about whether Sophie was worth the cost of losing Claire, and immediately felt wrong for thinking it, and then sat with the feeling until it settled into something more honest. Not that the loss was worth it, but that Sophie was the thing that made it possible to keep going, and that was different. That was just survival making itself available in the form of a person you loved. He didn't say any of this, but he thought Victoria understood the shape of it anyway, because she was looking at him with the kind of look that didn't require translation. Tell me something about Claire, she said, not as a demand, not pushing, just offering the space. He thought for a moment about what to say. He never talked about Claire to anyone in Millhaven, and the absence of it had become its own habit. And breaking the habit felt like touching something that might still be tender. But Victoria was asking, and he found to his mild surprise that he wanted to answer. She made terrible coffee, he said. Victoria blinked. Then, what? She was brilliant at almost everything. Genuinely capable person. Could fix a car, read a contract, grow things in soil that shouldn't have grown anything. He shook his head. Could not make a decent cup of coffee to save her life. I don't know why. She didn't lack the ability to follow a process. She just had contempt for the concept of measuring things. He paused. I drank bad coffee for 6 years and I never told her. Why not? Because she was so pleased with it every time. She'd hand me a cup with this. He smiled, and it was a real smile, one that came from the actual memory rather than from the performance of being okay. She had this expression, like she'd done something generous. And she had, just not the coffee. He set down his mug. I still measure everything when I make it, more than I need to. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific kind of love, she said. The tolerating bad coffee kind. The not telling her because the expression was worth it kind, he said. Yeah. She nodded. That's the real kind. He felt something move through him that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like the memory occupying its proper space, neither too large nor pushed away. Just there, real and past and still part of him without swallowing everything else. She would have had opinions about you, he said. Victoria raised her eyebrows. Good ones or bad ones? She had opinions about most things, he considered. She respected direct people, people who didn't perform. He looked at Victoria. She would have liked you. She would have also probably tried to set us up and then been insufferable about it. Victoria laughed. The real one. The one that broke through. I'll take that. The trouble arrived on a Friday, the way trouble often did. Not in any dramatic form. Just as a phone call at 7 in the morning from an unknown number that turned out to be Marcus Webb's assistant. Victoria had not spoken Marcus's name aloud in Mill Haven until the porch conversation. She had told Daniel the broad outline, the marriage, the company, the incompatibility dressed as a project. But she had not mentioned the specifics of the situation she'd left, which were more tangled than she'd let on, because she'd been managing them at a distance since she'd moved here, and had hoped they would stay at a distance. Marcus had apparently decided they would not. She came over that afternoon looking like someone who had been on the phone for 4 hours, which she had. She knocked on the workshop door, and Daniel turned around and saw her face and set down his tools. "What happened?" he said. She came in. She stood in the middle of the workshop with her arms crossed. Not the comfortable cross from before, but the kind that was holding something in. "Marcus is contesting the ownership structure of the company," she said. "He had our attorney draft a claim that his involvement in the early stages entitles him to a larger share than what he received in the divorce settlement." She looked at the wood shavings on the floor. "He's been building the claim for 8 months. Apparently the timing of his filing is intended to coincide with our fiscal year close, which maximizes the disruption." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Can he do that?" "His attorney thinks he has a case. My attorney thinks he doesn't." She shook her head. "The issue isn't whether he wins. The issue is that even filing it creates enough uncertainty around our stock structure that our board gets nervous. And a nervous board means my CEO, who I trust, who I left it with, who I've spent the last 8 months trying to let run it without interference." She stopped. "She's calling me every 2 hours. He came out from behind the workbench and stood closer to her, not touching her, just being nearer. "What do you need to do?" "I need to go to New York." She said it like she'd been arguing with herself about it all day and had finally lost. "Not forever. Maybe a week. 2 weeks at most. Enough to sit in the room and let the board see that I'm not rattled and get the legal team aligned." She looked at him. "I don't want to go." "I know. I left that place because I was—" She stopped. "I was done with the version of myself I was there. The always being in the room, always being the person who managed everything version." She looked frustrated in a way that was more honest than her usual composure. "And now I have to go be her for 2 weeks. She's still you," he said. "She's a version of me I'm not sure I trust anymore." He thought about that. "You trust her enough to have built something that's still standing," he said. "You trust the person you left in charge enough to still be in charge. That's not nothing." She looked at him. "When did you get reasonable about this?" "I've been reasonable the whole time," he said. "You've been ignoring me." Something shifted in her face, the frustration giving way to something that was almost amusement, which he'd been aiming for. "I haven't been ignoring you." "Selective hearing," he said. "It's fine. Sophie does it too." She shook her head, but the amusement was real now. Then it faded, and she just looked at him, and there was something in the looking that was more complicated than he'd been prepared for this particular Friday afternoon. "I'm afraid it'll pull me back," she said. "That place, those people. I'm afraid I'll go back and it'll—" She gestured, a frustrated, incomplete gesture. "That it'll make all of this feel small." He understood what all of this meant. He understood it in a way that sat uncomfortably close to his chest. "Do you think it will?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said, "but I was afraid of it enough to tell you." "Good," he said. "Tell me the things you're afraid of. That's useful." She looked at him with a slight tilt to her expression that he was starting to learn meant she was recalibrating. "You're doing the thing where you treat everything like a problem to be managed. Is that wrong?" "It's not wrong, it's just—" She paused. "You don't always have to fix what I say. Sometimes I'm just saying it." He took this. He stood with it for a moment, being honest with himself about whether she was right, and concluded that she was. "Okay," he said. "Say it then." She breathed out. "I'm afraid it'll feel small." He didn't fix it. He just stood there in his workshop, wood shavings on the floor and the smell of sawdust around them, and let her be afraid of it without rushing her out of it. After a moment, she said quietly, "I haven't told Sophie yet." "I'll be there when you do," he said. Set. Sophie took it like Sophie took most things, in full, without evasion, with a question that cut straight to the center. They told her together that evening, the three of them at Victoria's kitchen table, and Victoria explained that she had to go to New York for work and that she'd be back in a week or two. And Sophie listened the way she listened when she was processing something real, that particular stillness coming over her. Then she said, "Will you come back?" The directness of it landed in the room and stayed there. "Yes," Victoria said, "I'm coming back." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Victoria leaned across the table slightly. "Sophie, this is my home. The peonies are here." She paused. "You're here." Sophie looked at her for a moment with those eyes, and Daniel watched her weigh the answer. He watched her decide, with the seriousness of a person who had already lost one important person and knew what that felt like, and was doing a calculation she was too young to have to do. "Okay," she said. Then with tremendous dignity, "I'll look after Gerald." "The earthworm?" Daniel said. "Someone has to," Sophie said. "Victoria will be gone." Victoria reached across the table and put her hand over Sophie's, briefly, just for a second, then pulled back. Sophie looked at the spot on her hand where Victoria's had been, then looked up. "You have to come back before the peonies die," she said. "They don't last very long. I looked it up." "I know," Victoria said. "I'll be back before they die." Sophie nodded, satisfied with the contract. She went back to her dinner. Daniel looked at Victoria across the table. She was looking at Sophie, and her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was holding something carefully, and he thought about the version of herself she was afraid to be in New York, the one who managed everything from rooms full of people who needed her to have no edges and no doubts. And he thought about how little that sounded like the woman who had made soup on a Sunday and planted peonies in spots she was told to plant them by a 7-year-old. He thought, she'll come back. Not because she'd promised Sophie, because he'd learned to read her these months, and the way she'd said "you're here" with no performance in it at all was the most honest thing she'd said yet. She left on Monday morning. Her car was packed the night before. She came over Sunday evening. They'd had dinner, the three of them, Sophie determinedly normal about it, which was its own form of maturity. And afterward, when Sophie was in bed and they were on the porch again, the warm May night around them, she said, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Leave somewhere I want to stay." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the dark yard, at the garden, where the peonies were still open, just visible in the low light from the kitchen window. "You've left a lot of places," he said. "I've left places I was done with," she said. "That's different." She turned to look at him directly. "I'm not done here." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. She nodded once, then looked back at the garden. They sat there for a while in the warm dark, not filling the silence with anything, and Daniel thought about how he'd spent 4 years building a life that didn't require him to be afraid of anyone leaving, and how that structure had been very effective and had cost him something he was only now beginning to calculate the full price of. "There's something I should tell you," she said, "before I go." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment, collecting it. "I knew who you were before I moved here." He looked at her. "What?" "Not personally." She turned to face him on the porch. "When I was looking at the house, my assistant sent me information about the neighborhood, property values, the town, local businesses." She paused. "Your workshop was in there. Carter Custom, the furniture. I'd seen your work before. Not in person. A piece you'd made was in a house I'd visited in Ann Arbor, a dining table, and someone had told me who made it and I'd looked you up, just casually. I'd forgotten about it until the listing came up." She looked at her hands. "When I moved in and found out you were next door, I don't know what I thought. I didn't plan anything around it. But I knew." He sat with this. "You never said." "No?" She looked at him. Because it sounded either like too much of a coincidence or too much of a plan, and it was neither. It was just a thing I knew and didn't say. She shook her head. "I'm telling you now because I don't want to leave with it unspoken. The not saying was starting to feel like hiding something, and I don't want to do that. He was quiet for a moment. He turned over the information, looking at it from different angles, checking his reaction against what he actually felt rather than what he expected to feel. The Ann Arbor table, he said. The Bergman house. They had it in the dining room. I made that 3 years ago. He thought about it. You really did just move in next door. I really did just move in next door. She looked at him steadily. I needed to tell you. He nodded. He sat with it. He thought about the workshop, about what went into a piece, about the grain and the finish and the hours of patient work that made a table last and feel like something rather than just function like something. He thought about the fact that a stranger had sat across that table in Ann Arbor and seen something he'd made with his hands, and it had connected, in some roundabout way, to this porch, this May night, this woman beside him. Thank you for telling me, he said. That's it? What else is there? She looked at him with something between disbelief and relief. I thought you might be, what? Angry that you saw a piece of furniture I made and remembered it? He looked at her. Victoria, that's not a thing to be angry about. She breathed out. I've been carrying that for 8 months. I know. He could tell. In the way she'd looked at the workshop those early weeks, in the slight hesitation she'd always had around asking about his work. I wish you'd just said it. I know. She looked at the porch floor. I didn't want it to change the way you saw things between us. I was afraid you'd think I moved here because of you, and I didn't. And by the time I trusted that you'd believe me, she shook her head. It just kept not being the right moment. He sat back. The night was around them, quiet and warm, the kind of quiet that had started to feel like something he wanted to keep. Go to New York, he said. Sort out your company. Come back. She looked at him. Come back, he said again, and the weight he put on it was more than the words, and he saw her hear it. She nodded. She stood from the porch chair and gathered herself to go, and he stood with her, and she was close enough that there was a moment, a pause that had options in it, and then she put her hand briefly against his jaw, the same place his had been on the stage, just for a second, just contact. I'll be back before the peonies die, she said. I know, he said. He watched her cross the dark yard. He stood on the porch until her light came on inside, and then he went in and stepped over the floorboard and went upstairs. In the morning, her car was gone. The peonies were still open. Sophie checked them before school, crouching in the dewy grass in front of the bed with her backpack still on her shoulders. And Daniel watched from the window and thought about someone who'd sat across a table he'd built 3 years ago and carried that small fact across every city and finally here, to this quiet town, to 30 feet away. He poured his coffee. He measured it carefully, the way he always did. He thought, 2 weeks. He thought he could do 2 weeks. The first 3 days were fine. Daniel had expected the absence to be more disruptive than it was. And when it wasn't, he spent a day mildly suspicious of his own equilibrium, then concluded that he was simply functioning the way he'd trained himself to function, task by task, hour by hour, one foot and then the other. He had the rocking chair commission to finish. He had Sophie's end-of-year school concert to prepare for, which involved locating a specific dress that Sophie had decided was the only acceptable garment for the occasion and which had not been seen since February. He had the backyard tree to deal with, which a local guy named Pete Sorrento had come to assess and declared needed to come down before fall or it would make the decision itself, probably in the direction of the fence. These were real things. He did them. Victoria texted the first morning, just landed, hotel is fine, board meeting tomorrow. And he wrote back something brief, and she wrote back something brief, and that was that. It was not a correspondence that would win any awards for emotional depth, but it was real, and he checked his phone for it and noted that he checked his phone for it. Sophie checked the peonies every afternoon. She'd appointed herself their steward with a seriousness of purpose that Daniel found both touching and slightly hilarious. She had a watering routine, had asked Daniel to look up whether peonies needed deadheading, and had informed Gerald the earthworm of the situation in case Gerald could be useful somehow. Daniel watched this from various distances and did not say anything about it except once that she was doing a good job. I know, Sophie said, without looking up from the garden bed. On day 4, Victoria called instead of texting. He was in the workshop, late, finishing the final code on the rocking chair, and he almost let it go to voicemail, then didn't. "Hey," he said. "Hey." Her voice was different, not bad different, but tighter, compressed, like she was in a smaller version of herself. "Are you in the middle of something?" "Just finishing up. What's happening?" "The board meeting was, She paused. "It was fine. My CEO handled it well. The legal team thinks Marcus's claim has about a 30% chance of going anywhere, which my attorney says is lawyer speak for it's a nuisance filing." Another pause. "But there's a thing." "What kind of thing?" "The board wants me to come back," she said. "Not for the Marcus situation. That's just the opening. They've been—" She stopped. "There's a faction. 3 of the 9 board members who have been patient with my absence because they respected the reasons for it, but who have been compiling a case that the company needs more active executive involvement, not just my CEO's management, but me. My name, my presence, my—" She made a sound of frustration. "My brand, basically." He sat down on the edge of the workbench. "Do you have to go back?" "No. I have no legal obligation." Her voice was careful. "But if I don't address it, I lose the board's confidence in the current structure. And that means my CEO loses their support, and she's done nothing wrong except be put in an impossible position." She breathed out. "So it's not that I have to. It's that someone I respect will pay the price if I don't." "How long?" he asked. "They want 6 months." He said nothing. "Not full time," she said quickly. "Not the way it was before, but present. In New York, in the room, for the critical period." She paused. "I told them I needed to think about it." The workshop was quiet around him. The rocking chair stood against the wall, finished, the finish on it glowing in the overhead light. He'd put 12 hours of work into that chair in the last week, and it was exactly what he'd wanted it to be, and he couldn't look at it right now. "Okay," he said. "Daniel, I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not upset. I'm processing." "I know." Her voice had something in it that he recognized, a careful unhappiness, the specific unhappiness of someone who had not wanted the situation and was in it anyway. "I'm not going to say yes without talking to you first. I want to be clear about that. I'm not making this decision from New York." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said. "Yes, I do, because whatever this is—" She paused, and when she said the next thing, she said it with the particular plainness she used when she was being most honest. "Because I'm not willing to treat you and Sophie like a fact I can work around. I need to talk to you about it like it affects you, because it does, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make the conversation easier." He sat in his workshop with the phone pressed to his ear and thought about the 4 years of careful management, about the life he'd built that didn't require him to need anything he couldn't provide himself. He thought about the creak in the floorboard that he'd never fixed. He thought about 6 months. "When do they need an answer?" he said. "End of the week." "Come home first," he said. A beat of silence, then, "There's more to sort out here. I was thinking I'd handle it from Victoria." He said it the way she sometimes said his name, steadily, no edge to it. "Come home and we'll talk about it here. Whatever you decide, decide it here." The silence lasted long enough that he thought he'd pushed too hard, had asked for something she wasn't ready to give, had miscalculated. Then she said, "Okay." "Okay," he said. "Day after tomorrow. I'll tell Sophie." She made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close, the breath of one. "Tell her the peonies are counting on her in the meantime." "She already knows," he said. "Chad. He told Sophie at dinner." She received the news that Victoria was coming back Thursday with a composure that Daniel recognized as the deliberate kind. Sophie was capable of genuine composure, but this was the version she produced when she had already decided not to make a scene about something she felt strongly about. "Good," she said. She ate her pasta, then, "Is she coming back because of the peonies or because of us?" "Both," Daniel said. Sophie nodded. This was apparently a satisfactory answer. She went back to her pasta. "There's also something you should know," Daniel said. because he'd decided in the workshop the night before that he wasn't going to manage this away from her, wasn't going to solve it before she had to see it. Victoria might have to go back to New York for a while, not forever, but for a few months, to deal with work. Sophie was quiet. She set down her fork. "How many months?" she said. "About 6. She looked at the table. He watched her sit with it, watched the small face working through something that was too large and too familiar for a 7-year-old, and he felt the specific parental ache of knowing you can't carry a thing for your child, can only be present while they carry it. "Is she coming back after 6 months?" Sophie asked. "That's the plan," he said. "But we're going to talk about it when she gets here. Together." Sophie looked up at him. "All 3 of us?" "All 3 of us." She picked up her fork again. She didn't say anything else about it, but she ate the rest of her dinner with the focus of someone who was thinking very hard about something and had decided to think about it privately, which was, Daniel recognized with a complicated feeling, exactly what he would have done at her age. Maybe at any age. Victoria arrived Thursday afternoon while Sophie was still at school. Daniel heard the car in the driveway next door and stood at the kitchen window and watched her get out. She was wearing what she'd worn to New York, the sharper version of herself, the city clothes. And she had a bag over her shoulder and she stood for a moment in her own driveway, looking at the house with an expression he couldn't read from this distance. Then she looked over at his house and saw him in the window and raised a hand. He raised his back. She went inside. He gave her an hour, which he spent in the workshop pretending to work and mostly just standing near the workbench. Then he went over. She'd changed into different clothes, jeans, the gray sweater that had been washed 100 times. And she was making tea when he knocked on the back door, and she looked, when she turned around, like herself. Not the compressed version from the phone call, just herself. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She set down the kettle. "Sophie's not home yet?" 40 minutes. She nodded. She poured the water over the tea and they sat down at the kitchen table, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at that angle that happened in late May in Michigan, golden and slightly slanted, and it was quiet and real, and he thought, this is what she was afraid she'd lose sight of. "Tell me about New York," he said. She told him. She told him about the board meeting, about her CEO, a woman named Priya who had been with the company for 7 years and who Victoria trusted the way you trusted people who had proved themselves in specific difficult circumstances, about the 3 board members who had been building their case, and about what she'd seen in the room when she walked in. She told him it had been strange to be there, that the city felt louder than she remembered, that she'd caught herself in a cab on the second day thinking about the garden. "The garden specifically?" he said. "The garden in the hardware store." She held her mug. "And Sophie's solar system project drying on your kitchen table." She paused. "And the porch." He nodded. "The thing about going back," she said, "is that it proved something I needed proved. That I could go back and be in a room full of people who needed me to be a certain thing and still know the difference between what they needed and what I was." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing. 3 months ago, I wasn't sure I could hold that line. And now? Now I know I can." She turned her mug on the table. "Which means the 6 months doesn't scare me the same way it did on the phone." He sat with that. "So you're going to do it. I want to hear what you think first." "I think," he said slowly, "that you built something real and you have a responsibility to the people you left running it. I think Priya sounds like someone worth showing up for." He paused. "I think 6 months is a long time and also not that long." She looked at him carefully. "That's a very measured answer." "I'm a measured person." "You are," she said, "sometimes to a fault." He looked at her. "What do you want me to say? That I don't want you to go?" "I don't want you to go, but I'm not going to be the reason you make a choice that costs someone else something real." He shook his head. "That's not who I want to be in this." She was quiet for a moment. "What is this?" she said. "Between us. What do you think it is?" He had known the question was coming, had been building toward it since the fair, since the porch conversations, since the night she'd told him about the Ann Arbor table, and he'd just nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me." He'd been building toward the question and avoiding it simultaneously, which was not a sustainable combination. I think it's real, he said. I think it's been real for a while, and I've been taking my time with it. Because I take my time with everything, and because he stopped, then made himself continue. Because the last time I let someone be important to me, she was gone. And I know that's not a rational thing to hold against the present, but it's there. Victoria didn't flinch from it. She held his eyes. I know, she said quietly. And Sophie, I know about Sophie. She leaned forward slightly. Daniel, I've thought about Sophie every step of the way. I haven't been here all these months and not understood what it means, what she would be attaching to. Her voice was steady, but not detached. I think about that constantly, the responsibility of being someone she counts on. If it didn't work, then we'd have to handle that, she said, carefully and honestly and with Sophie at the center of it. She shook her head. I can't promise you it works. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise you I don't take it lightly. Not any of it. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. 6 months, he said. 6 months. And I'd come back when I could. Not every weekend, that's not realistic, but come back for Sophie's birthday, he said. That's in September. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, and it wasn't the composed version, it was the underneath one. When in September? The 14th. I'll be here, she said. I'll be here for that. He nodded. He looked down at the table. Then he said, when Sophie gets home, we tell her together. All three of us, like I told her it would be. Okay? And we tell her the truth, not a managed version of it, the truth. That's the only version I know how to give her, Victoria said. Sophie came through the back door at 3:52 and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when she saw Victoria sitting at the table. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she crossed the kitchen with the particular speed of a 7-year-old who has decided something, and she put her arms around Victoria's neck from behind, a full, unannounced hug, and Victoria reached up and held both her arms, and they stayed like that for a moment. Daniel sat across the table and watched this, and felt something in his chest that was very large and had no easy name. The peonies are okay, Sophie said into Victoria's shoulder. I told you I'd take care of them. I know you did, Victoria said. I never doubted it. Sophie pulled back and went around to sit in her usual chair, dropping her backpack in the usual place on the floor, and she looked at both of them with the particular 7-year-old gravity she was capable of. Dad said you might have to go back to New York. I do, Victoria said. For about 6 months, for work. Sophie was quiet. But you're coming back. I'm coming back. Victoria looked at her directly. I'm coming back for your birthday in September, and after the 6 months I'm coming back here, to the house, to the garden. She paused. To you and your dad. Sophie absorbed this. She looked at Daniel, checking something, and he nodded once, and whatever she was checking for, she found. Okay, she said. She looked at Victoria. Gerald is fine too, she added. In case you were wondering. I was definitely wondering, Victoria said. Sophie got up to get a snack, and the moment moved through its own brief life and became a before, because after it something had been named that they'd all been living around for months, and named things held differently than unnamed ones. The week before Victoria left for New York the second time had its own particular weather. Daniel was aware of this without being able to fully describe it. There was a texture to the days that was different, not worse, just weighted. The ordinary things happened: dinner, the workshop, Sophie's homework and bath, and the bedtime inspection of teeth. But layered underneath all of it was the consciousness of a clock that had started, and the specific quality of paying attention to things you usually took for granted because you knew they were going to be intermittent for a while. He noticed this in himself and didn't fight it. He'd gotten better over these months at not fighting what was simply true. Victoria had things to do before she went. Arrangements for the house, the garden, a conversation with her attorney that she took on the porch one evening while Daniel sat near her and pretended to read, and she talked in the clipped, precise way she had when she was navigating things she didn't enjoy. She handled it all with her usual competence, and he watched her do it, and thought about what she'd said in the workshop doorway weeks ago, about the version of herself in New York. I don't know if I trust her anymore. and thought that the woman on the porch handling her attorney while maintaining the threat of 3 other things was not a version to distrust. That version was just her, doing what she knew how to do. He told her this one evening, not as a speech, just as a sentence. She looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about that." "A little." "You could have said something sooner." "You seem to be figuring it out yourself," he said. "You didn't need me confirming your own conclusions." She was quiet. Then, "I've been thinking about something you said, about Claire, about the bad coffee." He looked at her. "You said you drank bad coffee for 6 years and never told her." She held his eyes. "I think about that a lot. What it means to love someone enough that you protect the thing that makes them happy even when it inconveniences you." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't have that with Marcus. I had competence and ambition and a shared vision. I didn't have the bad coffee." He thought about this. "You want someone to drink bad coffee for?" "I want someone who would," she said. "That's different from wanting to make bad coffee." He almost smiled. "That's a fine distinction. I'm a precise person." She was looking at him with the direct, unhurried quality that he'd first noticed in the driveway 8 months ago, that quality of someone who was entirely present in the space they were in. "I want to say something before I go." "Okay." "I love this," she said. "What we have. I don't—" She shook her head. "I'm not saying it to create pressure or change anything. I'm saying it because I've been carrying it and it's true, and I'd rather you have that information than not have it while I'm gone." He sat with it. The porch was quiet. The night around them, the garden behind her in the dark. He thought about the 4 years of not needing things. He thought about the floorboard. He thought about 6 minutes and 14 seconds and a 7-year-old's hands clasped together in the front row. "I know," he said. "I know you do." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I'm getting there," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not holding back to protect myself. I'm getting there because I want to do it right." He looked at her. "When I say it, I want it to be because I'm in it, not because the moment called for it." She nodded slowly, and he could see in her face that this satisfied something. Not the answer she might have hoped for, but an honest one, and honest was what she'd asked for since the beginning. "Okay," she said. "That's enough." "It's enough?" "Daniel." She looked at him. "You just told me you're getting there. Do you understand what that is for you?" He thought about it. He supposed he did. She left on a Sunday morning. Sophie was up early and stood in the driveway while Victoria loaded the last of her bags, and Sophie had clearly been prepared to hold herself together and was doing a reasonable job of it. She gave Victoria a folded piece of paper at the last moment, something she'd made, Daniel couldn't see what, and Victoria unfolded it carefully and looked at it, and her expression did the thing that it did when she let something through. "I'll hang it up," Victoria said, "in the New York place, so I can see it." "It's the peonies," Sophie said. "So you remember what they look like." "Ma, I know what they look like," Victoria said, "but thank you." She hugged Sophie. She stood up and looked at Daniel over Sophie's head, and he held her eyes and nodded once, and she nodded back. She got in the car. She pulled out of the driveway. He and Sophie stood on the sidewalk between their houses and watched her car go down the street and turn at the corner. The morning was cool and clear, the particular clear of a Michigan morning in early June. Sophie put her hand in his. He held it. "She'll be back," Sophie said. She wasn't asking. She was saying it the way you say true things out loud so they take up proper space in the air. "She'll be back," he said. They stood there a moment longer, then went inside. Daniel made coffee, measuring it carefully, 2 precise level spoonfuls the way he always did. He set Sophie's cereal on the counter, and she climbed onto her stool, and they moved through the morning the way they always moved through mornings. The familiar choreography of 2 people who knew each other's rhythms by now, who knew where the other one was going before they got there. He poured his coffee and stood at the window. The garden next door was visible from here. The peonies still open, a few of them starting to soften at the edges but still holding. Gerald was presumably in the soil beneath them, conducting whatever business earthworms conducted. The house was quiet and locked and waiting. He drank his coffee. He thought 6 months. He thought about the rocking chair he'd finished for the birthday commission, about the new piece he was starting next week. A commission from a couple in Kalamazoo who wanted a bed frame with a headboard, something simple but well made, something built to last. He thought about the work, which always gave him back to himself when he needed it. He thought about what Victoria had said. I love this. Not I love you. That specific, that careful, the this that contained everything between them without overstating what it was yet. He thought about what he'd said back and about how she'd called it enough and about whether he had actually understood. In that moment, what he'd admitted. He had said, I'm getting there. And she had looked at him like he'd handed her something real. He thought maybe he had. Sophie ate her cereal. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor the way it always did. Outside, the peonies were still open, pink and unself-conscious, doing the only thing they knew how to do. He set down his coffee cup. He thought about the creak in the floorboard. He went to the hall closet and found the toolbox. It took him 20 minutes and 2 different screws and a wood shim from the workshop. He'd done it wrong the first time, which required starting over, which required a specific kind of patience he'd gotten better at over the years. When he was done, he walked over the spot 3 times, back and forth, and the floor was silent. Completely, finally silent. He stood there for a moment. Sophie appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked at him, she looked at the floor, she looked back at him. You fixed it, she said. Yeah, he said. She considered this for a moment with the full weight of her attention. Then she walked over the spot herself, slowly, testing it, and looked up at him with the expression she had when something confirmed what she already suspected. She didn't say anything else. She went back to her room. He put the toolbox away. He went to the workshop and started on the plans for the Kalamazoo bed frame. The measurements laid out on the table in front of him, and he got to work. The summer without Victoria was not as bad as Daniel had expected, which surprised him, and not as easy as he told himself it would be, which did not. He worked. He finished the Kalamazoo bed frame in 3 weeks, which was fast for him, and the clients were pleased, and he felt the specific satisfaction of a piece that had come out right. The headboard had a quiet elegance to it, joinery tight enough that it wouldn't shift or creak in 20 years, wood selected for grain direction so the whole thing read as one continuous thought rather than assembled parts. He took a photograph of it before delivery, which he didn't always do, and sent it to Victoria without comment. She responded within 10 minutes. That's beautiful. The grain on the headboard. How long did you spend picking that board? Longer than I'd like to admit, he wrote back. I believe it, she said. It shows. This was, he thought, one of the better text conversations he'd had in recent memory, which either said something about the quality of the exchange or something about the general state of his social life, probably both. He talked to her on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. Not long calls. She was busy in a way that was real, and he understood real busy. But consistent ones, the kind that created their own rhythm. She'd call on Tuesday evenings after her board meetings because that was when she needed to decompress, and they'd talk for 40 minutes while he sat on the porch and she walked around whatever apartment the company had put her in, which she described as aggressively neutral, the kind of space designed to remind you it was temporary. Are the walls actually white? He asked once. They're greig, she said, which is what happens when someone is afraid of white but can't commit to beige. That's deeply depressing. I hung Sophie's drawing, she said, right above the desk. It's the only non-greige thing in the entire room. He thought about that. Sophie's pink peonies on paper, in a greige New York apartment, above a desk where Victoria managed the kind of decisions that moved money in amounts Daniel couldn't easily imagine. He thought about how those 2 things could exist in the same space, the 7-year-old's drawing and the billion-dollar problem, and how maybe that was actually the point, having something that reminded you which things were real when the other things got loud. He told Sophie that Victoria had hung the drawing. Sophie received this information with quiet satisfaction, nodded once, and went back to whatever she was doing. But he noticed that evening she drew another one, not peonies this time, something he couldn't identify at first, until he leaned over and saw it was a house, their street, 2 houses side by side with a garden between them. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked at it and then at his daughter's bent head and felt the specific weight of being someone's whole world and wanting badly to be worthy of it. June became July without ceremony. Sophie went to day camp for 3 weeks and came home every day smelling like sunscreen and lake water and with a comprehensive account of everything that had happened, which was delivered at full volume from the moment she got in the truck. Daniel drove and listened and asked the right questions and thought about how she was getting better at telling stories, not just recounting events, but shaping them, knowing what to put in and what to leave out, building toward the part that mattered. He didn't know where she'd learned that. He suspected she'd figured it out herself. Victoria's legal situation with Marcus resolved at the end of June. She called him the evening it happened, and he could hear something in her voice that wasn't quite relief. Relief was the wrong word because it implied she'd been afraid. And she hadn't been afraid exactly, more like carrying a low-grade irritant for 8 months that had finally been removed. The judge had ruled the claim without merit at the preliminary hearing, Marcus's attorney having apparently overestimated both the strength of the case and the patience of the court. "It's done," she said. His attorney withdrew the remaining motions this afternoon. "How do you feel?" "Like I wasted 8 months of mental energy on someone who deserved less of it." She paused. "And also glad. Mostly glad. What happens now?" "Now I finish what I came here to do and go home." She said it without hesitation, the word home landing clean and specific, no uncertainty in it. He heard it and didn't make anything of it out loud, just filed it in the same place he'd been filing things all summer, the growing record of evidence about what this was and where it was going. "Good," he said. "Sophie will be glad. Gerald is frankly struggling without the supervision." She laughed, the real one. "How is he actually?" "He's a worm," Daniel said. "He's fine. He has no idea what's happening. Unlike everyone else in your house." "Unlike everyone else in my house," he agreed. The board situation resolved more slowly and with more friction than the legal one, which was how those things usually went. Victoria managed it from inside the room the way she'd said she would. Present, competent, the version of herself that had built something worth fighting about. She told Daniel about it in pieces, not as complaint, just as reporting, the way people reported things to someone they trusted to hold the information without doing anything unnecessary with it. There was a moment in late July that she described on a Tuesday call, a board meeting that had gone badly sideways, one of the 3 difficult members pushing for a restructure that would have fundamentally changed Priya's authority, and Victoria having to be the one who stopped it, clearly, publicly, in a way that would have consequences for her relationship with that board member going forward. She'd done it because it was right, and because Priya had earned what Victoria had built for her, and she'd done it without enjoying it. "Did it work?" Daniel asked. "For now," she said. "He'll regroup and try again from a different angle. That's what he does." She breathed out. "But Priya knows I showed up for her. That's what I needed her to know." "And the others?" "The others saw that I'll take a real position when it matters, which is apparently what they needed to see before they'd back off and let Priya run the company." She paused. "It's exhausting. The whole thing is exhausting. I'd forgotten how much of corporate leadership is just managing egos in rooms." "You're good at it, though." "I'm competent at it," she said. "That's different from good. Good implies you find some satisfaction in it." She was quiet for a moment. "I find satisfaction in the outcome, not the process." He thought about what she'd said in the hardware store, about standing there for 20 minutes choosing caulk. "You're coming back to a town where the most complex political situation is who gets to run the pie contest." "I'm going to find that extremely refreshing," she said. He smiled into the phone. 2 months. 8 weeks, she said. "I'm counting weeks." Sophie is counting days. "Sophie has always been smarter than both of us," Victoria said. "Bah." August moved the way August moved in Michigan. Slowly at first, and then suddenly. The days long and warm, and then one morning you'd wake up, and there was something different in the air, a faint, cool edge that the afternoon would erase, but that said, things are shifting. The trees were still full and green, but you could feel them thinking about it. Daniel finished 2 more commissions. A coffee table for a couple in Grand Rapids who'd seen the Ann Arbor dining table at a friend's house and tracked him down, word of mouth still being the most reliable engine of his business. And a pair of matching nightstands for someone local, a retired teacher who'd been saving up for them for 2 years and who stood in the workshop on the day she came to pick them up and ran her hands along the edge of one of them with an expression that was worth more than what she'd paid. He drove around the lake one Sunday with Sophie, and they stopped at a roadside stand and bought corn and ate it on the tailgate of the truck without plates or ceremony, butter running down their arms. And Sophie laughed at the mess of it, and Daniel thought, this is the life, not as a phrase but as a direct and specific fact. He was beginning to understand, happy. Not in a resolved, finished way. Happiness was not a destination he'd arrived at. More like he was living in a way that contained it, regularly, in real amounts. The workshop in the mornings. Sophie's voice from down the hall. The coffee measured exactly right. The fixed floorboard that made no sound when he stepped over it. The phone that rang on Tuesday evenings. He was aware that some of what he was living toward was still 2 months away. And he was aware that he was living toward it, and he didn't fight the awareness the way he once would have. The week before Sophie's birthday, Victoria called on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday. He was in the workshop, and he picked up on the second ring. "Everything okay?" he said. "Yes." She sounded different. Not bad different. "I wanted to tell you something." "Okay." "I'm coming home Saturday," she said. "Not the 14th. Saturday." He stood very still. "That's a week early." "I know." There was something in her voice that he couldn't quite read, something warm and slightly uncertain together. "Priya and I had a conversation yesterday, a real one, about what the next year looks like and what my role actually is and what it isn't." She paused. "She told me that the most useful thing I could do for the company at this point was trust her enough to leave, and that the board had settled, and that she had it." "Did you believe her?" "Yes," Victoria said. "She said it the way people say things they've been waiting to say for a long time. Very directly, no build-up." She paused. "She reminded me of someone." He said nothing. He could hear her smiling on the other end of the line. "I'm coming home Saturday," she said again, like she needed to say it twice to make it fully real. "If that's—" "Yes," he said. "I haven't finished what I told the board I'd—" "Victoria," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Okay," she said. Her voice had the sound of something that had been held tightly being allowed to loosen. "Okay. Saturday." He spent approximately 1 minute after the call standing in the workshop doing nothing, just standing there with his phone in his hand and the wood shavings on the floor and the light coming through the window at its particular angle. And he thought about the 4 years of careful management and the creak in the floorboard he'd finally fixed and the bad coffee he'd never complained about and every small way a person could let love pass through their hands without holding it. He went inside and told Sophie. She looked at him. She looked at the calendar on the refrigerator, which she'd been marking in her own private countdown system. She looked back at him. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday." She turned back to what she was doing. She'd been drawing again, another picture. And she picked up a pink crayon and pressed down hard on the paper, filling in a shape he couldn't see from here, and she said without looking up, "I knew she'd come back early." "You knew?" "I had a feeling," she said, in the tone of someone who was being modest about a conviction. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. He thought about the horse she'd wanted, the medium one from the dream that bit someone who deserved it. He thought about the earthworm named Gerald, and the wrong-colored Saturn, and the solar system project, and the picture hanging in a Grayja, New York apartment. He thought about all the ways this small person had moved through the world with her arms wide open while he'd been keeping his carefully at his sides, and how she'd been right about most things, and how she got that from her mother, and how he was glad she had it. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Saturday arrived the way significant days often did, looking exactly like all the other days right up until it didn't. Daniel had been up since 5:30. He'd made his coffee, he'd gone to the workshop for 2 hours in the early morning, he'd done all the regular things. Sophie had woken up at 7 with the focused energy of a person who had a plan for the day, eaten her breakfast efficiently, and disappeared to her room to do something she declined to describe. At noon, Daniel was in the kitchen when he heard a car. He didn't go to the window. He heard the car pull into the driveway next door, heard the engine cut, heard a door. He stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee cup and waited, because going to the window felt like admitting something about the last 8 weeks that he'd been perfectly capable of admitting but hadn't needed to rush toward. Sophie appeared from her room at a dead run. "She's here," Sophie announced, in the tone of someone delivering news that confirmed a long-held theory. I know, he said. Come on, Sophie said, already at the back door. Give her a minute, Daniel said. She just pulled up. Sophie looked at him with the expression she reserved for when she thought he was being genuinely unreasonable. She's been gone 8 weeks, she said. She doesn't need a minute. She went out the door. He heard her cross the yard. He heard Victoria's voice, not the words, just the sound of it, and then Sophie's voice, higher and faster, telling her something with the urgency of a person who had been saving up information for 8 weeks and was now releasing it all at once. He set down his coffee cup. He went out. Victoria was crouching in the driveway, at Sophie's level, listening to her with the complete attention she always gave her, and she looked like herself, the Millhaven version, jeans and a jacket, her hair down. Not the New York version, just her. When she heard him cross the yard, she looked up, and he saw the moment she registered that he'd come out, and something in her face shifted in a way he'd been thinking about for 8 weeks without letting himself think about it too directly. He stopped a few feet away. Sophie was still talking, something about Gerald and about a new earthworm she'd found and had not yet named, pending Victoria's input on naming conventions. Welcome back, Daniel said. Thank you. She looked at him over Sophie's head. Her eyes were doing the warm, direct thing. The peonies are gone. End of June, he said, as advertised. I made it back before they died, she said. You did. Sophie had wound down to a natural pause and was looking between them with great interest. Are you going to hug? She asked. Sophie, Daniel said. It's a reasonable question, Sophie said. Victoria stood up from her crouch. She was looking at him with a slight smile that was holding something back, and he thought about all the things he'd been holding back, all the reasonable, careful management of the last 4 years and the last 8 weeks, and really the last 8 months. And he thought about what it had cost and what it had bought, and whether the accounting had ever made as much sense as he'd told himself it did. He closed the distance between them and put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the driveway in the September Michigan sunshine and held on, not dramatically, not performing it, just two people who had missed each other and were being honest about that fact in the simplest possible way. Sophie made a sound of deep satisfaction. I told you, she said, to no one in particular. I told you. Victoria came for dinner that evening. This had always been the natural shape of things, but it was different now, not tentative or carefully managed. She helped Sophie set the table. Sophie had decided on a specific arrangement that involved a centerpiece of items she'd collected from the yard, which Daniel had opinions about and was wise enough to keep to himself. And she sat in her usual chair, and they ate the meal Daniel had made, and the conversation was exactly what it had always been, the three of them in the rhythm that had built itself over a year of ordinary evenings. After dinner, Sophie went to brush her teeth with elaborate demonstration of compliance, and Daniel and Victoria did the dishes the way they'd started doing dishes in the last weeks before she left. Not by plan, just by standing next to each other and handing things and putting things away, the choreography of people who'd learned where everything went. How's Priya? He asked. Good, Victoria said. She called me this morning, actually, just to check in. She dried a pot. She said something I keep thinking about. What? She said, the best thing you ever did for this company was leave and then come back with something better to protect. She folded the dish towel. I think she meant you. He looked at her. She doesn't know me. She knows enough, Victoria said. She said I sounded like someone who had found something they weren't expecting and knew the value of it. She set the folded towel on the counter. She's perceptive. He was quiet for a moment, turning a glass in his hand before putting it in the cabinet. Then he said, I fixed the floorboard. She looked at him. I know, Sophie told me. When? In her 8-week debrief, Victoria said with a slight smile. It was item 4. After Gerald, after the unnamed earthworm, and after the camp swimming incident, which I am very glad I only heard about and did not witness. She's fine, he said. She's always fine. She really is, Victoria said. The kitchen was clean. The house was quiet in that particular way it got when Sophie was doing her thing before sleep. The specific quiet of a house that had a person in it who was about to go to sleep, which was different from the quiet of a house where you were alone. He had spent 4 years learning to tell the difference. He knew it very well. He turned to face Victoria. She was leaning against the counter, looking at him with the direct, unhurried quality, the one that had been one of the first things he'd noticed. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I've been getting somewhere," he said, "all summer. I told you I was getting there, and I was, and I'm—" He stopped. He was not performing this. He was just trying to say the true thing in the right words, which was the only kind of saying that had ever meant anything. "I'm there," he said. "I want you to know that. I love you. Not because you came back, not because the summer made me feel it more than I already did. I already did. I just needed to be sure I was saying it from solid ground and not from the fear of losing something." She was looking at him, and her jaw was doing the tight thing, the held carefully thing, and her eyes were the underneath version, the one she didn't always let out. "That's a very Daniel way to say I love you," she said. "Is that—" "It's exactly right," she said. "It's exactly you." She pushed off the counter and came toward him and put her hand against his chest, the way she had on the stage, flat, pressing in slightly, just making contact. "I love you too. I've loved you for a long time, and I think you knew it, and I think you needed to come to it yourself, and I was willing to wait as long as it took." "That's a very Victoria way to handle it," he said. She smiled fully, the real one that broke through the composure. "We're a good match," she said. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he said. "We've barely started." "We've been starting for a year," she said. He couldn't argue with this. He put his hand over hers on his chest, the two of them standing in the kitchen in the quiet, and he kissed her. Not the 6-minute, 14-second kind, not a contest or a revelation or a dam breaking. Just this. Two people who had chosen each other clearly, on purpose, with their eyes open. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I brushed my teeth," she announced. They stepped back from each other. Not with guilt. She was 7, and this was not a secret she didn't already know, but with the instinct of parents everywhere who understood the value of not traumatizing your child with the kitchen sink. "Good job," Daniel said. Sophie looked at Victoria. She looked at Daniel. She looked at their faces in the specific way she had, the 7-year-old forensic analysis, and whatever she found satisfied her. "Okay," she said. "Good." She turned to go to bed, then stopped. "Victoria, will you be here tomorrow?" "Yes," Victoria said. "And the day after?" "Yes." Sophie nodded. "Good," she said again. She went to bed. October came, and the trees made their announcement, the way Michigan trees did every fall, with a completeness that was almost aggressive. The maples going red and orange, the oaks holding on to their green a few weeks longer before giving it up all at once. The light on those days having a quality that was entirely its own, amber and slanted and temporary in a way that made you want to be outside in it. Victoria stayed. She went to New York once more in October. 2 days, a board formality, the kind of thing that required her physical presence, even though everyone in the room knew the real decisions had already been made. She went and came back within 48 hours, and when she came back, she brought Sophie a snow globe from a shop she'd passed, Manhattan inside it, the skyline in miniature, and Sophie shook it and watched the snow fall and said it was beautiful and put it on her windowsill next to the rock collection she'd been building since she was 4. Daniel went with Victoria to look at the house properly, to talk about what she wanted to do with it long term, whether she'd stay or whether she'd eventually want something different. She said she was staying. He asked if she was sure. She looked at him and said, "Daniel, I planted peonies here. I don't plant things I'm not going to tend." He thought this was probably the most accurate sentence she'd ever said about herself. The question of what they were, in the public, Millhaven sense, answered itself the way those things answered themselves in small towns, gradually and then all at once. Margaret Henderson saw them at the hardware store in October, the two of them standing in the caulk aisle, and she said, "Oh, it's about time," with such warm certainty that there was nothing to do but agree. Patsy from the diner started putting 3 coffee cups on the table when they came in, before they'd asked. Sophie's teacher asked Sophie how her family was, and Sophie said, "Good," with the ease of someone for whom the word had become uncomplicated. They were not, as a unit, seamless. Daniel was still inclined toward quiet when he was worried and needed to be asked the right question before he'd say what was actually on his mind, which was a habit Victoria identified early and addressed directly, which he found both clarifying and mildly aggravating. Victoria still had the ability to go fully internal when a problem felt unsolvable, to get locked inside her own processing in a way that went quiet for too long. And Daniel had learned to read this and to ask the question that opened the door rather than waiting for her to come out on her own. These were small things, and they were real things, and navigating them took actual attention, which they both gave because the alternative was the kind of inattention that let things drift. He thought about this sometimes, about what made something work. He was not someone who believed in effortless. He had made furniture his entire adult life, and he knew, in the physical, practical way of someone who worked with his hands, that nothing worth having was effortless. The wood resisted. The grain had its own opinion. The joint had to be cut right, or it would fail years later under exactly the weight it was supposed to bear. You didn't wish this away. You worked with it. You learned what each piece needed, and you gave it that. And the result was something that lasted. He thought relationships were probably like this. He thought most things worth having were like this. The effort wasn't the cost of the love. The effort was part of the love. The showing up and the asking and the sitting in the kitchen doing dishes and the being honest about what you needed and the tolerating, occasionally, the things that drove you a little bit crazy, because the person on the other end of those things was worth the crazy. He thought about Claire. He thought about her often, not with the weight he used to carry, but with the particular quality that belonged to people you had loved and lost and kept, not held on to, because holding on had a rigidity to it that grief didn't actually have, not after a while. You just carried them, the way you carried anything that had shaped you. She had shaped him. She had given him Sophie, who was the truest thing in his life, and she had made him understand what it meant to love someone in the daily specific way, the bad coffee way, the way that was made of small things more than grand gestures. He didn't think she would have wanted the 4 years of careful management. He thought she would have been impatient with it, actually. She had never been a patient person, had possessed a clear-eyed intolerance for self-protective delay that he'd sometimes found challenging and always admired. He thought she would have liked Victoria. He thought she would have been smarter about all of it than he had been. But he also thought, and this was something he'd arrived at slowly, over the summer, over the long Tuesday phone calls, and the mornings in the workshop and the evenings on the porch, that the 4 years had not been wasted. They had been what they were, a man learning how to be a father to a specific, extraordinary child, learning the particular shape of his grief, and then learning to live alongside it rather than around it, learning what he actually needed rather than what he'd decided to stop needing. That was not wasted time. That was just the time it took. And now was now. Sophie's birthday fell on a Tuesday, which meant it was both a school day and a phone call day. And the evening of it was therefore layered with significance in a way that Sophie either genuinely didn't notice or very convincingly pretended not to. They had her party that Saturday, a small one, the Kowalski girl and 2 others from her class, a cake that Victoria had made from scratch, which had come out slightly lopsided on one side, and which Sophie had declared the best cake she had ever seen because of the lopsided side specifically. There were streamers. There was a moderate amount of chaos. The Kowalski girl knocked over a glass of juice, and it went on the white tablecloth Victoria had put out, and everyone went completely still for a second the way people did when something got spilled on a nice thing. And Victoria looked at the stain for a moment and then said, "It's fine," in a tone that meant she had genuinely decided it was fine, not in a martyred way, just in the way of a person who had recalibrated what mattered since she'd last had white tablecloths. Daniel watched this from across the room and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. Not where they'd planned, not where they'd managed themselves into, but simply here. In this slightly chaotic room with lopsided cake and a juice stain, and Sophie turning 8 with the full commitment she brought to everything. On the actual birthday Tuesday, after school, Daniel took Sophie to Patsy's for dinner. A birthday tradition, the 2 of them, always Patsy's. And Sophie ordered the pancakes the way she always did because Sophie believed pancakes for dinner was an appropriate assertion of birthday privilege. And Daniel had the meatloaf because he always had the meatloaf. And they sat in the booth they usually sat in, and it was theirs this evening, The way some things became yours through repetition until you couldn't imagine them being anyone else's. 8, Daniel said. 8, Sophie confirmed. She poured syrup with great care. How does it feel? She considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. Different, she said. 7 felt kind of small. 8 feels, she searched for the word, like more room. He looked at her across the table. The diner light caught her hair the way it had always caught Claire's. She had Claire's stillness and his patience and something that was entirely her own, some quality of presence, of taking up space without apology, that he wasn't sure he could name properly, but that he recognized every time he saw it. It does, he said. 8 has a lot of room. Sophie ate her pancakes for a moment. Then, not looking up, Dad, are you happy? He sat with the question. He didn't deflect it or manage it into something simpler. He thought about it the way it deserved. Yeah, he said. I am. She looked up at him. Because of Victoria? Because of you, he said. And because of Victoria. And because of the work, and this diner, and the peonies, and the fixed floorboard. He held her eyes. Because of all of it together. Sophie nodded slowly. That's the right answer, she said. Is it? You can't be happy because of just one thing, she said, with the simple authority of a person who had arrived at a truth by living it. If it's just one thing, then when that thing is gone, you're not happy anymore. She went back to her pancakes. Happy has to be bigger than that. He stared at his daughter for a long moment. Where did you get that from? He said. She shrugged. I just thought of it. He picked up his fork. He thought, she is going to be something. He thought it the way he'd thought it since she was 3 years old, and talking in complete sentences about things that weren't supposed to be in her range yet. He thought it with the specific pride of a father who knew he couldn't take credit for it, and didn't want to, who just wanted to have a front row seat to whatever she was going to be. Smart kid, he said. I know, she said, which was perfectly, entirely Sophie. But in November, Victoria told him she'd officially filed the paperwork to transfer her primary residence to Mill Haven. Not as a gesture, not as a statement, just as a legal and logistical fact that matched the actual facts on the ground. Her attorney had some opinions about this. Her accountant had more, and she had listened to both of them and then done it anyway, because she had found over the last year that she was better at distinguishing between the voice of genuine wisdom and the voice of people who were afraid of change on her behalf. She told him on the porch, where they spent most of their evenings when the weather allowed, and even sometimes when it didn't quite allow it, wrapped in jackets as October tipped into November and the nights got cold and the trees let everything go. Done, she said. It's official. How do you feel? He asked. Good. She thought about it. More than good. I feel like something that has been sideways has finally straightened. He thought about that. He thought about the things that could be sideways for years, and you didn't always notice until they were straight again, until you felt the difference in your own bones. I have something to tell you too, he said. She looked at him. I've been thinking about the workshop. He turned his mug in his hands. There's a guy in Grand Rapids, a furniture maker, been doing it for 30 years. He called me last month, asked if I was interested in doing something collaborative. He has commissions he can't fill alone, and he's looking for someone to take some of the work. Long-term partnership. He paused. It would mean more commissions, more volume, better supply access. It would also mean less solitary and more together. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it. I think I'm going to say yes. She was quiet for a moment. What changed? He looked out at the yard. The garden was bare now. The peonies long gone until spring. The earth turned and waiting the way earth waited. He thought about what had changed. He thought about all of it, the whole year, from the driveway in February to this porch in November, and how the accumulation of ordinary moments was how a life rebuilt itself. Not in one brave decision, but in 100 small ones, each of which required only that you be willing to let something in. I stopped thinking that doing things alone was the same as being strong, he said. I think I thought that for a long time. that needing people was the thing that could hurt you. He shook his head. But it's the other way around. Needing people is just true. It's true about being a person. You don't get to not need them without also not having them. He paused. And having them is the thing. Having them is what all the rest of it is for. Victoria was looking at him in the dark, and he could see her face in the light from the kitchen window, and she had the underneath expression, the one he had by now mapped completely, knew every variation of. "You should call him back," she said. "I'm going to," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it, and they sat like that in the cold November air, looking at the dark yard and the bare garden and the two houses side by side. He thought about loss. He thought about the way people talked about it as a thing that happened and then ended. You lost someone. You grieved. You moved on. He had never found this accurate. Loss was not a chapter that closed. Claire was not a chapter that had closed. She was part of the structure of him, had shaped the way he held a tool and the way he looked at his daughter, and the way he'd been careful, too careful, for too long. She was in the floorboard that he'd finally fixed, and in the coffee he measured twice. She was in all of it. But love was not finite. That was the thing he had taken 4 years to understand, that he thought maybe you couldn't understand until you were on the other side of it. Loss didn't consume the capacity for love. It changed it, yes, made it more serious, more aware of what it meant to be handed something you could lose. But it didn't reduce it. If anything, it deepened it, made it more honest, made you less likely to waste it on things that didn't deserve it. He thought, grief doesn't end. It just changes shape. It becomes something you carry differently, something that fits in your hands better over time, something that reminds you, when you're paying attention, what mattered and what still matters, and how the two things are not as separate as you once thought. He had loved Claire. He loved her still, in the way you love someone who is woven into you, who is part of what you are. And he loved Victoria, in the way you loved someone who stood next to you in the present tense, who showed up on Tuesday evenings and grew peonies and argued with him about Jupiter's moons and sat with him in kitchens at 11:40 and told him true things because she trusted him with them. These loves did not compete. They were not the same shape or the same weight, but they both fit. He held Victoria's hand in the cold and thought about Sophie asleep upstairs, warm in her room, surrounded by her rock collection and the snow globe and the drawing still unfinished on the desk. He thought about what she'd said at the diner, happy has to be bigger than that, and thought about how a child could sometimes look at the world with a clarity that adults spent years working their way back to. Happy had to be bigger than one thing. It had to be built out of many things, ordinary things, the kind that didn't announce themselves. The coffee in the morning, the creak of a floor that no longer creaked, a name in your phone on a Tuesday, a drawing hanging on a grage wall in a temporary room, peonies in soil that Sophie had pointed to and said, "There." The things that lasted were the ones you gave attention to, and he had finally learned how to pay attention again. The yard was quiet. The trees were bare. Victoria's hand was warm in his. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie was asleep, already dreaming of the next thing, already carrying the world forward on behalf of all of them. He was home.